Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been running the Dalton Highway for 9 years now, and I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty. Alaska doesn't care about you. Not your schedule, not your deadlines, not the fact that you've got a wife and 2 kids waiting back in Fairbanks. The state just sits there, frozen and patient, waiting for you to make one wrong move. My name's Archer Sloan, and I haul freight between Fairbanks and Deadhorse. It's 414 miles of some of the most unforgiving road in North America. Gravel, ice, permafrost heaves that'll shake your fillings loose, and stretches so remote that if something goes wrong, you're on your own for hours. Maybe days if the weather turns bad. The Dalton isn't a highway. It's a test of whether you deserve to keep breathing in this state. Most people don't understand what it means to drive the haul road in winter. They see pictures of the midnight sun and think Alaska is some kind of adventure paradise. But winter up here is different. Winter is when the state shows you what it really thinks of human beings trying to survive in a place that was never meant for us. I took this particular run on a Tuesday in late February. The load was standard. Drilling equipment and supplies heading up to the North Slope oil fields. Weight was good, paperwork was clean, and my Kenworth was running smooth after the engine work I'd had done the week before. Everything looked routine when I pulled out of Fairbanks at 2 in the afternoon. The first 100 miles went fine. I passed the occasional southbound truck, waved at a couple of drivers I recognized, and made decent time on the sections where the road was properly maintained. The temperature was sitting at around -25, which is cold but manageable if your equipment is solid and you've got the right cold weather gear. Around mile marker 115, just past the Yukon River Bridge, I stopped at the Hotspot Cafe for coffee and to check the road conditions with the other drivers. There were 3 trucks in the lot when I pulled in, and I recognized 2 of the drivers from previous runs. We stood outside in the cold, drinking coffee that was too hot to taste, talking about the usual things. Ice conditions, rough patches, whether the graders had been through recently. That's when Mason Hayes mentioned the Aurora. Mason's a veteran driver, maybe 60 years old, with a face that looks like it's been carved out of the same rock as the Brooks Range. He's forgotten more about the Dalton than most drivers will ever learn. "Aurora's gonna be strong tonight," he said, staring north toward the mountains. "Been watching the forecasts. Solar activity is high. Should be quite a show if the clouds stay clear." I'd driven under the northern lights plenty of times before. It's one of the things that makes the Dalton bearable, those nights when the sky lights up in green and purple curtains that dance across the stars. Beautiful, yeah, but also a little unsettling when you're alone in the cab at 3 in the morning, watching light move across the sky in ways that don't seem natural. "Just hope it doesn't mess with the CB," I said. Aurora activity can interfere with radio signals, and the CB is your lifeline up here. Without it, you're cut off from other drivers, from road condition updates, from anyone who might help if things go wrong. Mason nodded slowly, still staring north. "Yeah," he said, "CB interference. That's what you gotta worry about." But something in his voice made me think he was talking about something else entirely. I finished my coffee, used the restroom, and got back on the road. The sun was already low on the horizon, and up here in February that means you've only got a couple more hours before full darkness sets in. The Dalton is intimidating enough in daylight. At night, especially in winter, it becomes something else entirely. By the time I passed the Arctic Circle marker at mile 115, the sky was starting to show the first hints of aurora activity. Faint green streamers appeared low on the northern horizon. barely visible against the fading twilight. I'd seen stronger displays before, but there was something about the way the light moved that night that caught my attention. It seemed more active than usual, more agitated somehow. The road conditions deteriorated as I pushed further north. The temperature was dropping fast, -30 now, maybe colder, and the wind was picking up. Not quite whiteout conditions yet, but enough to kick up snow devils that would dance across the road in my headlights. Little tornadoes of ice crystals that appeared and vanished in seconds. I passed through Coldfoot around 9 p.m., the last real outpost of civilization before you hit the absolute wilderness of the Brooks Range. The truck stop was busy with drivers either preparing for the push north or settling in for the night. I considered stopping, maybe getting a hot meal and waiting until morning to continue. But I was making good time. The weather forecast showed conditions holding steady, and I wanted to reach Deadhorse before the weekend shift change. That decision, to keep driving instead of stopping at Coldfoot, is something I've thought about every day since that night. I fueled up, checked my load straps, and headed back out into the darkness. The aurora was stronger now, visible even with the lights of Coldfoot behind me. Green sheets rippled across the sky, and I could see hints of red and purple at the edges. It was going to be a major display. The road climbed steadily as I entered the Brooks Range, winding through mountain passes where the walls rose up on either side like something out of a nightmare. The wind was stronger up here, whistling through the valleys and hitting my trailer in gusts that made the whole rig shudder. I downshifted and kept my speed conservative, knowing that one patch of black ice in the wrong place could send me sliding off the road and into a ravine. Around midnight, I reached Adigun Pass, the highest point on the Dalton at 4,139 feet. The aurora was directly overhead now, filling the entire sky with curtains of light that rippled and danced in ways I'd never seen before. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like watching something alive moving across the darkness. That's when I started to notice the first strange thing. My CB radio, which had been quiet for the last hour, suddenly crackled with static. I was used to radio interference during aurora activity, but this was different. Instead of the usual random static, there seemed to be a pattern to it, a rhythm. I adjusted the squelch bay, trying to clear the signal, but the static remained. And underneath it, barely audible, I thought I could hear something that might have been a voice, or maybe just the wind playing tricks through the radio frequencies. I told myself it was just interference, nothing to worry about. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A single word repeated over and over in that broken static. Mile. I grabbed the mic. This is Sooner Express northbound on the Dalton at Adigun Pass. Anyone got their ears on? Nothing but static, and that word again. Mile. 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 I switched channels, tried a few different frequencies, but every channel had the same static with that same word buried in it. I turned the CB off, waited 30 seconds and turned it back on. Still the same thing. The logical part of my brain said it was just aurora interference creating random sounds that my tired mind was interpreting as words. I'd been driving for 10 hours straight, and it was easy to start hearing things that weren't there when you were exhausted and alone in the darkness. I left the CB on, but turned the volume down and focused on the road ahead. The pass was behind me now, and I was descending the north side of the Brooks Range, heading down toward the north slope. The road here is tricky. Steep grades, sharp turns, and if you hit your brakes too hard on ice, you can lock up and slide. That's when the second strange thing happened. My headlights caught something on the road ahead, and for just a second I thought I saw another truck. Not unusual. There's traffic on the Dalton even in the middle of the night. But this truck looked wrong somehow. The shape was off, and the lights were too dim. like they were old halogen bulbs instead of modern LEDs. I blinked, and the truck was gone. Nothing ahead but empty road and blowing snow. I checked my mirrors, thinking maybe I'd somehow passed it, but there was nothing behind me either. Just the aurora light reflecting off the ice and making shadows that moved wrong. I shook my head, trying to clear the fatigue. I needed to stay sharp. This was no place to start hallucinating. The aurora was even stronger now, so bright that it actually cast shadows on the snow. Green and red curtains rippled overhead, and I could see the light reflecting off the frozen surface of the Sagavanirktok River that runs parallel to the road through this section. It was beautiful in a way that made you forget how dangerous it was to be out here alone. I'd driven under strong auroras before, but this one felt different. The light seemed more intense, more focused somehow, like it was concentrating on this specific stretch of road, and the shadows it created didn't move right. They seemed to lag behind the movement of the light, staying in place for a second too long before shifting to match the aurora's dance. My CB crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer. Mile 303. It was a man's voice, flat and emotionless, giving a mile marker location. I glanced at my odometer. I was at mile 298, so 303 would be coming up in just a few minutes. I grabbed the mic. This is Sooner Express. Who am I talking to? Nothing but static. Then the voice again. Mile 303. I didn't like this. The rational explanation was another driver somewhere ahead of me, maybe having radio trouble and trying to communicate his location. But something about the voice bothered me. It didn't sound quite right. Too flat, too mechanical, like a recording rather than a real person speaking. The road ahead curved to follow the river, and the aurora light on the ice created an effect that made it look like the river was glowing from within. I'd never seen anything like it. The whole landscape looked alien, like I'd somehow driven off Earth and onto some frozen moon where the laws of nature worked differently. Mile marker 303 appeared in my headlights, a standard reflective sign on a metal post. Nothing unusual about it, but as I passed it, my CB exploded with static so loud I had to grab the volume knob and turn it down. And underneath the static, I could hear multiple voices now, all talking over each other, all saying the same thing. The Aurora Mile, the Aurora Mile, the Aurora Mile. I turned the CB completely off. My hands were shaking slightly, and I told myself it was just the cold, just the normal physical response to driving in negative 30-degree weather. It had nothing to do with the voices on the radio or the way the shadows moved wrong under the aurora light. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of ice between walls of snow pushed up by the graders. My headlights caught the reflective markers on the side, little yellow dots that marked the edge of the pavement. I focused on those markers, using them to keep myself centered on the road, trying not to look at the aurora or think about the voices I'd heard. But then I noticed something that made my breath catch. The markers on the right side of the road were there, evenly spaced just like they should be. But the markers on the left side were wrong. They were spaced irregularly, appearing and disappearing in ways that didn't make sense. And some of them seemed to be floating above where the road should be, like they were marking a path that existed a few feet higher than the actual pavement. I slowed down, watching the markers carefully. They flickered in and out of visibility, and I realized with growing unease that they seemed to be pulsing in time with the aurora overhead. When the light was bright, the markers were there. When the light dimmed, they vanished. This wasn't right. Reflective markers don't pulse. They don't appear and disappear. They're just pieces of plastic with reflective tape, nothing more. But what I was seeing defied that simple explanation. I kept driving, going slower now, my eyes fixed on the road ahead and trying to ignore the wrongness of everything around me. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed negative 35, The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. The clock showed 2:47 a.m. Everything normal, everything exactly as it should be. Except for the aurora shadows and the pulsing markers and the way the road ahead seemed to shimmer like heat haze, even though it was 40 degrees below zero. I'd been driving the Dalton for 9 years through every kind of weather and every season. I'd driven through whiteouts where you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. I'd driven through windstorms that rocked the truck so hard I thought it would tip over. I'd driven through cold so severe that diesel fuel started to gel in the lines despite the additives. I knew this road, knew every mile marker and every turn, knew it better than I knew the streets of my own neighborhood back in Fairbanks. But right now, on this stretch of road under this aurora, I didn't recognize where I was. Nothing looked familiar. The landscape that should have been burned into my memory from dozens of runs looked alien and wrong, like I was seeing it for the first time, or like I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that just looked like the Dalton Highway but wasn't. Not really. I reached for my cell phone, thinking I'd try to call my dispatcher or maybe my wife, just to hear a human voice that would anchor me back to reality. But there was no signal. Not surprising, cell coverage on the Dalton is spotty at best, and up here in the Brooks Range it's basically non-existent. I was alone with my thoughts, and the aurora light and whatever was happening to the road ahead. The CB stayed off. I didn't want to hear those voices again. Didn't want to hear them chanting about the Aurora Mile or giving mile marker numbers that seemed to predict exactly where I'd be a few minutes later. Better to drive in silence, to focus on the mechanical task of keeping the truck moving and staying on the road. Mile marker 310 passed, then 315, then 320. The aurora overhead was starting to fade now, the curtains of light growing thinner and less intense. I felt myself relaxing slightly as the display dimmed. Maybe, once the aurora was gone, everything would go back to normal. The markers would stop pulsing, the shadows would move right, and I'd be back on the familiar Dalton Highway instead of whatever strange version of it I'd been driving through. But as the light faded, something else happened. The road ahead of me started to look different. Not dramatically different, but subtly wrong in ways I couldn't quite define. The curve of the road didn't match what I remembered. The distance between mile markers seemed too long or too short, and the landscape on either side looked simultaneously familiar and alien, like I was looking at a photograph of the Dalton that had been slightly altered. I told myself I was just tired, that 10 hours of driving had exhausted me more than I'd realized, that my brain was playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something else was happening. Something that didn't have a rational explanation. The aurora was almost gone now, just faint traces of green light on the northern horizon. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, showing me nothing but road and snow and the reflective markers that had finally stopped pulsing and started behaving like normal markers should. I checked my odometer. Mile 327. I tried to remember what should be at mile 327, maybe a turnout, maybe a creek crossing, but my memory was blank. And that scared me more than anything else because I knew this road. I'd driven it dozens of times. I should know every mile marker, every feature, every landmark. But right now, under the fading aurora light, I didn't know where I was. And that's when I saw the truck stop ahead. The building appeared in my headlights about a quarter mile ahead, sitting just off the road on the right side. A small structure with a peaked roof, covered in snow, with a single light burning in one window. Next to it was what looked like a fuel pump and a parking area with space for maybe 3 or 4 trucks. I'd driven past this spot dozens of times and I'd never seen a building there before. Never seen any structure at all except for the occasional maintenance shed or storage container. This part of the Dalton was wilderness. No settlements, no permanent structures, nothing but road and tundra and mountains. But there it was, solid and real in my headlights, with smoke coming from a chimney pipe on the roof and that single warm light promising shelter from the cold and the darkness and the strangeness of the night. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was wrong, that this building shouldn't be here, that stopping would be a mistake I'd regret. But I was exhausted and confused and starting to doubt my own memory of the road. Maybe there had always been a truck stop here and I'd just forgotten about it. Maybe my mind was so tired that it was filling in gaps with false memories. Or maybe I just needed to stop and talk to another human being, to confirm that I wasn't going crazy, that the road was still the road and the world still made sense. I slowed down and put on my turn signal, even though there was no other traffic to signal to. The parking area was empty except for one other truck, an older Peterbilt with mud flaps and chrome exhaust stacks that looked like they came from 20 years ago. The fuel pump had a price sign that was too faded to read in the darkness. I pulled in and parked next to the Peterbilt, leaving my engine running because in this cold, if you shut down, there's always a chance you won't start up again. I sat there for a moment, looking at the building, trying to decide if I should go inside or just stay in my warm cab and wait for sunrise. The door to the building opened and a man stepped out. He was wearing a heavy parka and insulated boots, and he waved at me in a friendly way that seemed genuine. Just a normal person at a normal truck stop, nothing threatening or strange about him. I opened my door and climbed down from the cab, feeling the cold hit me like a physical blow. -35 will steal your breath if you're not ready for it, will freeze the inside of your nose in seconds, and make your eyes water uncontrollably. "Cold one tonight," the man called out. His voice was muffled by the fur-lined hood of his parka, but it sounded friendly enough. "Got coffee inside if you want some." Coffee sounded good. More than good. I nodded and followed him toward the building, my boots crunching on the packed snow. Up close, the structure looked even older than I'd thought. The wood siding was weathered gray, and the window frames were the old-style divided panes instead of the modern single sheets of glass you see everywhere now. The door opened into a small room that was blessedly warm, heated by a barrel stove in the corner that radiated heat like a small sun. There was a counter with a coffee pot and some supplies, a couple of chairs, and a doorway that led to what looked like a storage area in the back. The walls were bare wood, and there were maps pinned up showing the Dalton Highway and the surrounding area. 2 other people were in the room, a woman sitting in one of the chairs, holding a mug of coffee, and another man standing near the stove, warming his hands. They looked up when I entered, and the woman smiled. "Welcome to Franklin's Waypoint," she said. "You look like you could use something hot to drink." I nodded, still not trusting my voice. Franklin's Waypoint. I'd never heard of it, but then again, I'd never paid much attention to the names of the few truck stops along the Dalton. Most of them were just referred to by their mile marker location. The man who'd waved me in poured coffee into a styrofoam cup and handed it to me. "Name's Hayes," he said. "You heading north or south?" "North," I managed. "Dead Horse, you?" "South, Fairbanks. Just stop to warm up and wait for better light." He gestured at the window. Aurora was playing hell with visibility for a while there. I nodded, sipping the coffee. It was strong and bitter and exactly what I needed. "Yeah," I said. "It was pretty intense." The woman stood up and walked over to the maps on the wall. She was maybe in her 40s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail. "You see anything strange out there?" she asked. Her tone was casual, but something in her eyes suggested the question was more important than it sounded. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to tell them about the pulsing markers and the voices on the CB and the way the road had looked wrong under the aurora light. But another part of me, the part that had been driving trucks for 9 years and didn't believe in ghost stories or supernatural nonsense, told me to keep my mouth shut. Just the aurora, I said. Pretty bright. She nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she already suspected. The aurora does strange things up here sometimes, she said. Especially on this stretch of road. Some drivers see things, some hear things. Most of them learn not to talk about it. The other man by the stove spoke up for the first time. Mile 303 to 327, he said. His voice was rough, like he'd been smoking for decades. That's the Aurora Mile, has been for as long as anyone can remember. Weird things happen there when the lights are strong enough. I felt my hands tighten on the coffee cup. What kind of weird things? Hayes shrugged. Depends on who you ask. Some guys say their GPS stops working right. Some say the mile markers don't match their odometer. Some say they see trucks that aren't there or hear voices on the CB that shouldn't be possible. And some drivers... He trailed off, glancing at the woman. Some drivers disappear, she finished. Not often, maybe once every few years. They're on the road and then they're not. Search and rescue finds their truck eventually, usually off the road somewhere it shouldn't be, like they drove straight off into the tundra for no reason. But they never find the driver. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss this as truck stop ghost stories meant to scare the new guys. But I couldn't. Not after what I'd experienced out there on the road. Not after the markers that pulsed with the aurora light and the voices that knew exactly where I'd be before I got there. Why is it called the Aurora Mile? I asked. The rough-voiced man stirred the coffee in his cup. Because it's not really a mile. It's however long the aurora wants it to be that night. Sometimes it's the regular 24 miles between those markers. Sometimes it's longer, sometimes shorter, and sometimes... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes it's a loop. You drive through it and come out the other side, but somehow you're back at mile 303 again, like the road folded in on itself. The woman walked back to her chair and sat down. The old-timers used to say it's because of something under the permafrost, something magnetic or geological that affects instruments and creates illusions. But nobody really knows. State Highway Department denies there's anything unusual about that stretch. Say it's just driver fatigue and aurora interference creating false perceptions. But you don't believe that, I said. She smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. I've driven the Dalton for 15 years. I've been through the Aurora Mile maybe 100 times. Most times it's fine. Normal road, normal drive. But when the aurora is strong, really strong like tonight. She shook her head. Then it becomes something else, something that doesn't follow the normal rules. I drank more coffee, trying to process what they were telling me. Part of me still wanted to dismiss it as superstition, as experienced drivers trying to freak out someone they thought was new to the road. But I couldn't shake the memory of those pulsing markers. Couldn't forget the voices on the CB or the way the road had felt wrong. So, what do you do? I asked. When you're in it and things start getting strange. Hayes walked over to the window and looked out at the darkness. You keep driving, he said. Keep your eyes on the road, don't look at the aurora too long and don't stop for anything. Most importantly, don't try to figure it out. Don't try to make sense of what you're seeing, just accept that it's happening and focus on getting through to the other side. And if you can't get through? I asked. The room was silent for a long moment. Then the woman spoke, her voice quiet. Then you end up like Parker. Who's Parker? Was Parker, she corrected. Driver out of Anchorage. Good guy, experienced, knew the road. He went through the Aurora Mile 3 years ago during a major display. Called his dispatcher from Deadhorse the next day, said he'd made it through but something was wrong. Said he couldn't remember parts of the drive, said his logbook showed hours that didn't match his memory. She paused, staring into her coffee cup. He made the return trip a week later. Should have taken him 10, maybe 12 hours. Search and rescue found his truck 4 days later, parked at mile marker 315, right in the middle of the Aurora Mile. Engine was still running, fuel tank still half full. Parker was in the cab, but she stopped, shaking her head. "But what?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. "But he was frozen solid," the rough-voiced man said. "Like he'd been sitting there for weeks, not days. Medical examiner couldn't explain it. Said the body showed signs of exposure that should have taken months to develop, not 4 days. And his logbook," he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "His logbook showed him driving through the Aurora Mile over and over again, the same 24 miles, for 6 weeks straight." I felt cold despite the heat from the barrel stove. "That's not possible." "No," the woman agreed, "it's not. But that's what the logbook showed. Same mile markers, same timestamps, over and over again. Like he'd been caught in a loop and couldn't get out." Hayes turned back from the window. "That's why we stop here when the aurora is strong," he said. "Franklin's waypoint is just outside the affected zone. A safe place to wait until the display dies down and the road goes back to normal. The state doesn't acknowledge it exists, and it doesn't show up on GPS or maps, but drivers know about it. We pass the information along, word of mouth, CB chatter. When the aurora is active and you're near mile 303, you stop here and wait." I looked around the room, seeing it differently now. Not a normal truck stop, but a refuge. A safe harbor for drivers who understood that something about this stretch of road didn't work the way it should. "How long have you been here?" I asked Hayes. He glanced at his watch. "Couple hours. Aurora was peaking around midnight and I didn't want to risk driving through it. But it's fading now. Should be safe to continue in another hour or so." I nodded and poured myself more coffee, settling into one of the chairs. If these experienced drivers thought it was smart to wait, then I'd wait too. I'd already seen enough strangeness for one night. Better to sit here in the warmth, drinking bad coffee and listening to stories, than to head back out into the darkness while the aurora was still active. The woman introduced herself as Briggs, no first name given, and the rough-voiced man was Dalton. "Not related to the highway," he said, with a grin that showed he'd made that joke 1,000 times. We sat around the barrel stove, and they told me more stories about the Aurora Mile. Most of them were second-hand, things they'd heard from other drivers, but some were their own experiences. Briggs talked about a night when her CB had picked up voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Not English or any native dialect she knew, but something older and stranger. Dalton described seeing his own truck in his mirrors, following him through the Aurora Mile, matching his speed exactly until the lights faded and the phantom truck vanished. Hayes stayed quiet, but when I asked him directly if he'd experienced anything unusual, he nodded slowly. "Once," he said. "About 5 years ago. I was southbound through the Aurora Mile during a major storm. Aurora was so bright you could read by it, even through the clouds and snow, and for about 10 miles I could see the road ahead wasn't the road I was on. It was like looking through a window into somewhere else. Same road, same landscape, but wrong somehow. Different. Different how?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time, staring at the stove. "The aurora was green in the sky I could see," he finally said. "But in that other road ahead, it was red. Blood red, filling the whole sky. And the mile markers I could see in that other place were counting down instead of up, like I was driving backward through my own route. What did you do?" "Closed my eyes and drove by feel," he said. "Kept the truck centered on the road, used the rumble strips on the shoulder to guide me, and didn't look up until I felt the weirdness pass. When I opened my eyes again, everything was normal. Regular aurora, regular road, counting up like it should." I shivered despite the warmth of the room. These weren't crazy people or liars trying to scare me. They were experienced professional drivers, people who'd been running the Dalton for years or decades. And they all believed that something genuinely strange happened on this stretch of road under the right conditions. We sat in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Outside, through the window, I could see that the aurora was indeed fading. Just faint traces of green now, nothing like the brilliant display that had filled the sky earlier. The darkness seemed more normal, less threatening. Around 4 a.m., Hayes stood up and stretched. "Think I'm gonna head out," he said. "Aurora's down, and I want to make Fairbanks before evening." He nodded to each of us, then headed for the door. I watched through the window as he climbed into his truck, started it up, and pulled out of the parking area. His taillights disappeared into the darkness, heading south, and I felt a small surge of envy that he was heading toward civilization, while I still had another 150 miles of wilderness ahead of me. Briggs and Dalton left 20 minutes later, both heading south. That left me alone in Franklin's Waypoint with a half-empty cup of coffee and my own thoughts about what I'd experienced and what they'd told me. I looked at the maps on the wall, studying the section between mile 303 and 327. Nothing on the map suggested anything unusual about that stretch, just road cutting through tundra and mountains like every other section of the Dalton. But the maps didn't show everything, couldn't show the things that only happened when conditions were right and the aurora filled the sky. I finished my coffee, used the bathroom, and stepped back outside into the cold. The aurora was completely gone now, and the sky was starting to show the first faint hints of dawn on the eastern horizon. In a few hours, it would be full daylight, and I'd be able to see the road clearly, without the distorting effect of artificial light and aurora glow. I climbed back into my cab, where the engine had been running the whole time, keeping everything warm and ready. The fuel gauge showed just under 3/4 full, more than enough to make it to Dead Horse without stopping again. I could bypass the Aurora Mile entirely if I wanted to, take the long way around by backtracking to Coldfoot and waiting there until full daylight before continuing north. But that would cost me time, maybe half a day or more, and I had a schedule to keep. Besides, the Aurora was gone now. According to the experienced drivers I'd just met, that meant the road would be normal again. Just regular asphalt and ice with no strange effects or impossible geometry. I pulled out of the parking area and headed back to the Dalton, turning north toward Dead Horse. I glanced in my rearview mirror, taking one last look at Franklin's Waypoint, but in the darkness and blowing snow, I couldn't see it anymore. It had already vanished behind me, invisible again, waiting for the next driver who needed refuge from the Aurora Mile. Mile marker 327 appeared in my headlights, the same marker I'd passed just before finding the truck stop. I checked my odometer, and the numbers matched correctly. Everything normal, everything as it should be. I drove through 326, then 325, and realized I was heading back into the Aurora Mile from the north end. But without the aurora lighting up the sky, it just felt like normal road. The markers were spaced correctly, the landscape looked familiar, and my CB was silent except for the occasional burst of static. By the time I passed mile marker 303, the sun was starting to rise, painting the Brooks Range in shades of pink and gold. I'd made it through the Aurora Mile twice in one night, once going north under the full aurora display, and once going south in the pre-dawn darkness with the lights gone. I should have felt relieved, should have been glad to have the strange experience behind me. But instead, I felt uneasy, like I'd narrowly avoided something dangerous without fully understanding what it was. The rest of the drive to Dead Horse was uneventful. I arrived at the oil field facility around noon, dropped my load, and immediately got dispatched for a return trip to Fairbanks. Standard procedure. You don't run the Dalton with an empty trailer if you can help it. The fuel costs alone make it inefficient. I picked up my southbound load, completed the paperwork, and started the return trip in the early afternoon. The weather was clear, the road was visible, and I was driving with plenty of daylight to work with. Everything felt normal and safe and routine, until I reached mile marker 327. The clock on my dashboard showed 3:47 p.m. when I crossed into the Aurora Mile heading south. Plenty of daylight still, with the sun low on the horizon but still visible. No aurora, no strange lights, no unusual atmospheric conditions. Just a regular afternoon drive on the Dalton Highway. But something felt wrong immediately. I can't explain it better than that. There was no visual change, no sudden shift in the landscape or the road. But the feeling in the cab changed, like the air pressure had dropped or the temperature had shifted. My skin prickled with goosebumps that had nothing to do with the cold outside. I checked my mirrors. Nothing behind me but empty road. I checked the gauges on my dashboard. Everything normal, engine temperature, fuel level, air pressure, all exactly where they should be. The load in my trailer was secure, properly distributed, no shifting or unusual sounds. Everything was fine, except it wasn't. I passed mile marker 326, then 325. The odometer matched correctly, clicking off the expected distance, but something about the mile markers themselves bothered me. They looked right, standard green and white signs with the correct numbers. But they also looked wrong somehow, like they were slightly out of focus or positioned at angles that didn't quite make sense. I blinked hard, thinking maybe the glare from the low sun was affecting my vision. But when I looked again, the markers still looked off. Not dramatically different, but subtly wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. My CB radio crackled with static, even though I'd had it turned off since leaving Dead Horse. I reached over and confirmed the power switch was in the off position, but the static continued, low and persistent. I turned the volume knob all the way down, and still I could hear it, like the sound was coming from inside the dashboard rather than through the speaker. Mile marker 320 passed, then 315. The sun was getting lower, and the long shadows it cast across the snow looked wrong. They were too long for the angle of the sun, stretching across the landscape in directions that didn't match the light source. And they moved wrong, shifting and changing position in ways that shadows shouldn't move. I tried my cell phone, thinking I'd call my dispatcher and let him know my position. But there was no signal, which wasn't surprising this far north. I put the phone back in my pocket and focused on driving, telling myself that I was just tired, that the strange events of the previous night had spooked me, and now I was seeing problems where none existed. But then I passed mile marker 315 again. I'd been watching my odometer, keeping track of the distance between markers, and I knew I'd already passed 315. But there it was in my headlights, the same green and white sign, the same numbers, mile marker 315. I checked the odometer. It showed I'd traveled the correct distance since the last marker, but the marker itself said 315 when it should have said 310. I'd somehow skipped 5 miles, or the markers were wrong, or the road was doing what the drivers at Franklin's Waypoint had warned me about, looping back on itself, folding into impossible geometry that didn't follow the normal rules. I kept driving, watching the markers carefully now. 314, 313, 312, all appearing at the correct distances according to my odometer. But my GPS, which had been working fine all day, was showing my position as stationary. The blue dot that represented my truck sat unmoving on the screen at mile 315, even though I was clearly traveling south at 50 miles per hour. The CB static grew louder, and underneath it, I started to hear voices again. Not clear words, just fragments of sound that might have been human speech. I reached over and pulled the CB power fuse from the panel under the dash, physically disconnecting the unit from power. The static continued. Mile marker 303 appeared ahead, marking the southern end of the Aurora Mile. I should have felt relieved to see it, should have been glad to be exiting the affected zone, but instead, I felt a growing sense of dread because I'd passed through these same 24 miles and I was pretty sure I was about to do it again. I crossed 303 and continued south, watching my odometer carefully. The needle clicked past the mark, recording the distance. But when I looked up at the next marker, my heart sank. Mile marker 327. I was back at the north end of the Aurora Mile. The road had looped, just like the drivers had said it sometimes did. I'd driven through the entire 24 miles, but instead of coming out the south end and continuing toward Coldfoot, I'd somehow ended up back where I started. I stopped the truck right there in the middle of the road. There was no other traffic, no one to worry about rear-ending me. I put the transmission in neutral and sat there with the engine idling, trying to figure out what to do. The logical thing was to keep driving. Eventually, the loop would break, and I'd be able to exit normally. That's what Hayes had said. Just keep driving. Don't try to make sense of it. Focus on getting through to the other side. But he'd also mentioned drivers who didn't make it through, who got caught in loops they couldn't escape. I looked at my fuel gauge. 3/4 full when I'd left Deadhorse, now showing just over half. I'd burned through a quarter tank driving a loop that should have only used a few gallons. That didn't make sense mathematically, but nothing about this situation made sense. I put the truck back in gear and started driving again, heading south through the Aurora Mile for the second time. This time, I paid closer attention to the landscape, looking for landmarks or features that might help me understand what was happening. The Brooks Range rose on both sides of the road, snow-covered peaks catching the last rays of sunlight. The Sagavanirktok River ran parallel to the highway on the right side, its surface frozen solid. Everything looked exactly as it should, exactly as it had looked the first time through, except for the shadows. Those were still wrong, still moving independently of the light source, still pointing in directions that didn't match the angle of the sun. Mile marker 320 passed, then 315, then 310. I watched each one carefully, checking my odometer, noting the distances. Everything matched correctly. The road was behaving normally, following the expected course from north to south. But when I reached mile marker 303 again and continued south, I knew what I was going to see next. Mile marker 327 appeared in my headlights, and I was back at the start of the loop. 3 times now, 3 complete circuits of the same 24 miles. My fuel gauge showed less than half a tank now, dropping steadily despite the fact that I should have been barely moving the needle. I was burning fuel at an impossible rate, like the truck was consuming gas for distance I hadn't actually traveled. The sun was setting, and that meant the aurora would be coming soon. The forecast had predicted strong solar activity for multiple nights in a row. Once darkness fell and the lights started up again, I'd be driving through the Aurora Mile under the same conditions that had caused the problems last night. I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't risk getting caught in this loop after dark with the aurora lights distorting everything. I needed to break out before sunset, needed to find whatever trick or technique would let me exit the affected zone. On the 4th loop through, I tried something different. Instead of following the road exactly, I let the truck drift slightly toward the right shoulder, riding the rumble strips just enough to feel them vibrating through the steering wheel. Hayes had mentioned driving by feel when he'd had his strange experience, closing his eyes and using the rumble strips to guide him. I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes, not at 50 miles per hour on ice, but I could minimize how much I was looking at the landscape. I focused on the immediate road ahead, just the next 100 feet visible in my headlights, and tried to ignore everything else. Mile markers passed in my peripheral vision. I didn't look at them directly, didn't check the numbers, just drove by feel, keeping the truck centered on the road, maintaining steady speed. The shadows grew longer as the sun dropped toward the horizon. The sky was starting to show hints of green aurora light, faint streamers appearing in the north. I had maybe 30 minutes of twilight left before full darkness, maybe an hour before the aurora reached the intensity it had displayed last night. I kept driving, focused on the immediate road, blocking out the peripheral weirdness. The rumble strips buzzed under my right tires, a steady vibration that kept me anchored to physical reality. This was real. The road, the truck, the physical sensations of driving. Everything else was distraction, illusion, aurora effects playing with perception. The CB static grew louder, and I heard voices clearly now. Multiple people talking over each other. I recognized Hayes's voice in there somewhere, and Briggs, and others I didn't know. They were all saying the same thing. Keep driving, don't stop, keep driving. Whether they were real voices or just audio hallucinations created by the loop, I couldn't tell. But the advice was good either way. I kept driving, kept my eyes on the immediate road, kept the truck centered and moving forward. The sky grew darker, and the aurora intensified. Green curtains danced overhead, and I could see red mixed in at the edges. The light reflected off the snow and ice, creating shadows that moved wrong, that seemed to have substance and weight instead of being mere absences of light. In my peripheral vision, I saw other trucks. They appeared alongside me, matching my speed, sometimes ahead and sometimes behind. When I glanced at them directly, they vanished, but I could always sense them in the corners of my eyes, driving the same loop I was trapped in. Were they real trucks from other nights, other drivers caught in the same effect? Or were they echoes, some kind of recording of past events playing out again under the aurora light? I didn't know, and trying to figure it out would only distract me from the task of escaping. Mile markers passed. I'd long since lost count of how many loops I'd completed. 5, 10, 20. Time was behaving as strangely as space, my dashboard clock showing numbers that didn't match my internal sense of how long I'd been driving. The fuel gauge was dropping toward a quarter tank, and if I didn't break out soon, I'd run out of diesel in the middle of the loop. That would be bad. Very bad. Because if I ran out of fuel and had to stop, I'd be stuck here, trapped in this section of road while the aurora effects continued around me. And based on what the drivers at Franklin's Waypoint had told me, being stuck motionless in the aurora mile during a strong display was how people ended up like Parker, frozen in their cabs with logbooks showing impossible journeys. The aurora was fully active now, as bright as it had been the previous night. The entire sky pulsed with colored light, green, red, purple, and the shadows it cast moved independently of the light source, sometimes flowing like water across the snow. I heard the voice on my CB again, the one that had been giving mile markers last night. Mile 315, it said in that flat, mechanical tone. I was approaching mile marker 315, or at least I would be if I was still driving in normal space and time. For all I knew, I was passing 315 every few minutes, looping through the same piece of road over and over. And then something changed. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that the road ahead looked slightly different. The shadows cast by the aurora seemed to be moving in a new direction, pointing toward something off to the right instead of just dancing randomly. I followed that direction with my eyes and saw what looked like a gap in the landscape, a break in the normal pattern of snow and rock. It might have been nothing, might have been just another illusion created by the aurora effects, but it also might have been the way out, the exit from the loop that I'd been trying to find. I made a decision. Instead of continuing straight on the road, I let the truck drift right, aiming for that gap in the landscape. The rumble strips buzzed louder as I crossed the shoulder line, and then I was off the pavement entirely, driving on packed snow and frozen tundra. The truck bounced and lurched over the uneven ground, and I heard the load shift slightly in the trailer. This was dangerous. If I hit soft snow or a hidden ravine, I could get stuck or tip over. But I kept going, following that intuitive sense that this was the right direction, that the gap ahead represented something real. The aurora light grew brighter, so intense that it was painful to look at directly. The colors swirled and mixed, creating shades I'd never seen before, hues that shouldn't exist in normal light. My eyes started to water, and I had to look down at the immediate ground in front of my truck just to maintain some sense of direction. The CB was screaming now, all static and distorted voices layered on top of each other until it was just noise. I heard my name in there somewhere, Archer Sloan, called out by voices I didn't recognize. How did they know my name? I'd never broadcasted over the CB, had always just used my handle or my company name. The truck hit something, a bump or a rock, and for a moment I thought we were going to tip over. The cab leaned hard to the right, and I heard the load groan and shift. But then we came down hard on all wheels, bouncing but staying upright, and suddenly everything changed. The aurora light vanished, not gradually fading but instantly gone, like someone had flipped a switch. The truck's headlights were the only illumination now, carving a tunnel through complete darkness. My dashboard lights seemed impossibly bright after the aurora glow, and I had to blink several times to adjust my vision. I realized I was back on pavement, though I had no memory of transitioning from tundra back to road. The rumble strips were on my left now instead of my right, which meant I was facing the wrong direction. Somehow, in that moment of intense aurora light and confusion, I'd turned completely around. I stopped the truck and sat there breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at my odometer, but the numbers seemed wrong, higher than they should be, like I'd traveled hundreds of miles instead of just the short distance off-road. My fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank. My clock showed 3:47 p.m., the same time it had shown when I'd first entered the Aurora Mile. But that was impossible. I'd been driving for hours, had gone through multiple loops, had watched the sunset and the aurora rise. It couldn't still be 3:47 in the afternoon. I grabbed my cell phone. Full signal now, 5 bars. I was back in range of the towers. I called my dispatcher and he answered on the first ring. "Archer, where the hell are you? Your GPS tracker shows you've been sitting at mile marker 315 for the last 4 hours. Is something wrong with your truck?" 4 hours. I'd been in the loop for 4 hours, according to the tracking system, even though it had felt much longer to me. And, according to the dispatcher, I'd been stationary the entire time, not moving at all, even though I'd driven what felt like hundreds of miles. "I'm okay," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Just had some GPS issues. I'm moving again now. I'll be in Fairbanks by morning." I hung up before he could ask more questions and checked my mirrors. Nothing behind me but darkness and empty road. No aurora, no phantom trucks, no strange shadows or impossible geometry. Everything looked normal now, looked real in a way it hadn't looked for the past several hours. I turned the truck around, got it facing south again, and started driving at a conservative speed. Mile marker 315 appeared in my headlights, then 310, then 305. Everything in the correct order, counting down normally as I headed south. When I reached mile marker 303, marking the south end of the Aurora Mile, I barely breathed until I'd passed it and saw 302 appear ahead. I was out, finally out of that section of road, back in normal space where the laws of physics worked the way they were supposed to. I drove straight through to Coldfoot, and stopped at the truck stop there, needing to get out of the cab and walk around and convince myself that I was really back in the normal world. The fuel pumps showed I'd consumed 3/4 of a tank, which matched my fuel gauge but didn't match the actual miles I'd traveled. I'd burned through an entire tank of diesel driving what should have been less than 100 miles. Inside the truck stop, I bought coffee and sat at the counter, my hands still shaking slightly. An older driver sitting next to me glanced over and nodded in recognition. "You just come through from the north?" he asked. I nodded. "Aurora was pretty active up there tonight," he said. "See anything interesting?" I looked at him, trying to gauge whether he was asking seriously or just making conversation. His eyes were knowing, like he'd heard this question asked and answered many times before. "The Aurora Mile," I said quietly. "I got caught in it." He nodded slowly. "Thought you might have, based on the look on your face. Most drivers get through it fine, some don't. You're lucky you got out when you did. Aurora's supposed to be even stronger tomorrow night. Have you ever gotten caught in it?" "Once," he said. 20 years ago. That was enough. Now, when the Aurora forecast shows high activity, I just stop here at Coldfoot and wait it out. Not worth the risk." He finished his coffee and stood up. "Take my advice, son. If you've got another run-up to Dead Horse scheduled for the next few days, postpone it. Let the Aurora activity die down first. Some experiences don't need to be repeated." He left, and I sat there thinking about his words. Part of me wanted to dismiss the whole thing as some kind of mass hallucination, as Aurora effects combined with driver fatigue creating false perceptions. But I couldn't explain the fuel consumption, couldn't explain the GPS showing me stationary for 4 hours when I'd been driving the entire time, couldn't explain the feeling of wrongness that had permeated every moment of that drive. I finished my coffee, got back in my truck, and completed the drive to Fairbanks. The rest of the trip was uneventful, just normal road and normal night and normal distance covered at normal fuel consumption. By the time I pulled into my company's yard at 6 a.m., I'd almost convinced myself that the Aurora Mile had been some kind of weird dream. But then I checked my logbook, the electronic system that records every moment of driving time and location. The entries for the previous afternoon were there, showing me entering the Aurora Mile at 3:47 p.m. and exiting at 7:51 p.m. 4 hours and 4 minutes, exactly as my dispatcher had said. But the location stamps were all over the place, jumping between mile markers in no logical order, sometimes showing me at 3:15 and 3:27 and 3:10 all at the same time. The system had recorded the truth, or at least its version of the truth. I'd been caught in a loop, driving through impossible geography, burning fuel to travel distances that didn't exist. I submitted my paperwork, went home, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept seeing those pulsing mile markers, kept hearing the voices on the CB, kept feeling that sense of wrongness that had filled the cab during those hours in the Aurora Mile. I took a week off after that run. Told my dispatcher I needed to handle some personal business, which wasn't entirely a lie. I needed time to process what had happened, needed to decide whether I was going to continue driving the Dalton or request transfer to other routes that didn't involve isolated stretches of Arctic highway. I spent those 7 days reading everything I could find about the Aurora Mile. There wasn't much in official sources. The State Highway Department maintained that the stretch of road between mile markers 303 and 327 was no different from any other section of the Dalton. But in trucking forums and CB radio channels, there were dozens of stories from drivers who'd experienced strange things in that area. Most of the stories were similar to mine. Drivers reporting GPS malfunctions, mile markers that didn't match their odometers, feelings of displacement or wrongness, that they couldn't quite explain. Some reported seeing other trucks that vanished when approached. A few described being caught in loops, driving the same section of road multiple times without being able to exit. And then there were the missing driver reports. Over the past 20 years, 11 drivers had vanished while traveling the Dalton Highway. Search and rescue had found their trucks in most cases, but not the drivers themselves. And in every case, the trucks had been located somewhere in or near the Aurora Mile. The official explanation was driver error combined with harsh conditions. Maybe they'd gotten disoriented during a whiteout. Maybe they'd suffered medical emergencies. Maybe they'd simply walked away from their trucks and gotten lost in the wilderness. But reading between the lines of the incident reports, I could see patterns that suggested something else was happening. Parker, the driver that Briggs had mentioned at Franklin's Waypoint, was one of those 11. His file showed he'd been an experienced driver with no history of violations or problems. The medical examiner's report mentioned the anomalous condition of his body, the freeze damage that shouldn't have been possible in the time frame, the logbook entries that showed impossible journeys, but the report concluded with cause of death, exposure due to vehicle abandonment, and the file was closed. No investigation into why an experienced driver would abandon a functioning truck in negative 40-degree weather. No explanation for the logbook anomalies, just a clean closure of an unexplained case. I also found references to Franklin's Waypoint, though not by that name. In old trucking journals and CB logs from the 1970s and 80s, drivers mentioned the safe house or the refuge somewhere around mile 325. But none of the references included specific location information, and there were no photographs or official records of the structure. One journal entry from 1982 described it perfectly. Small wood building, barrel stove, maps on the walls, appears only when the Aurora is active. Don't know how it works, don't care. Just grateful it's there when you need it. So, Franklin's Waypoint was real, or at least other drivers had experienced it. That was something. It meant I hadn't hallucinated that part of the night, that the refuge existed as a genuine safe harbor for drivers caught in the Aurora Mile. At the end of my week off, I made a decision. I was going to keep driving the Dalton. Not because I wasn't afraid. I was terrified, if I'm being honest. But because running away from something you don't understand doesn't make you safe. It just makes you ignorant. I wanted to understand what the Aurora Mile was, why it affected some drivers and not others, what was actually happening to the road and space and time in that section. And the only way to understand it was to keep driving through it, to keep observing and documenting and trying to find patterns. My dispatcher was happy to have me back, and he immediately assigned me to another dead horse run. Weather's supposed to be clear for the next few days, he said. Should be a smooth trip. I didn't tell him that clear weather wouldn't matter if the Aurora was active. The Aurora had nothing to do with terrestrial weather patterns. It was a function of solar activity and Earth's magnetic field, and neither of those cared whether there were clouds or clear skies. I checked the Aurora forecast before leaving Fairbanks. Moderate activity predicted for the next 3 nights. Nothing like the major display I'd driven through the previous week. Hopefully, moderate activity wouldn't trigger the strongest effects, wouldn't create the loops and impossible geometry. The drive north was uneventful until I reached Coldfoot. I stopped there for fuel and food, and while I was inside the truck stop, I struck up a conversation with another driver who was heading north. His name was Wyatt, younger guy, maybe been driving the Dalton for 2 or 3 years. "You ever hear about the Aurora Mile?" I asked him, casually. He looked at me sharply. "Where'd you hear that term?" "Around," I said. "Just wondering if it's something to worry about." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. then lowered his voice. Yeah, I've heard about it. Never experienced anything myself, but I know drivers who have. They say if you're going through that section and things start feeling weird, you should find Franklin's waypoint and wait it out. You know where Franklin's waypoint is? He shook his head. Doesn't show up on GPS or maps, but drivers say you'll see it if you need it. That's how it works. It's there when you need refuge, invisible when you don't. I thanked him for the information and got back on the road. The sun was setting as I passed through the Brooks Range, and I could already see faint traces of aurora on the northern horizon. Moderate activity, just like the forecast had predicted. Nothing to worry about. But as I approached mile marker 327, that feeling of wrongness started to creep back in. Not as strong as before, not as overwhelming, but definitely present. The air pressure in the cab seemed to drop slightly, and my skin prickled with static electricity. I turned on my CB radio, keeping the volume low. Static immediately filled the speaker, and underneath it, I could hear that same flat voice giving mile markers. Mile 327. Mile 326. Mile 325. The markers appeared in my headlights at the correct intervals, counting down normally. But they had that same slightly out of focus quality I'd noticed before. That subtle wrongness that suggested they weren't quite positioned in normal space. My GPS showed my location accurately, the blue dot moving smoothly along the road. But I noticed it was updating more slowly than usual, the refresh rate lagging by a second or two. Not enough to cause problems, but enough to be noticeable. I kept driving, maintaining steady speed, watching the mile markers carefully. 320 passed, then 315, then 310. Everything seemed normal, except for that persistent feeling of wrongness and the slow updating GPS. At mile marker 305, I saw lights ahead on the right side of the road. For a moment, I thought it might be another truck, but as I got closer, I realized it was Franklin's waypoint. The small building was there again, smoke rising from the chimney, that same single light burning in the window. I wasn't caught in a loop this time, wasn't experiencing the extreme effects I'd dealt with the previous week. But the waypoint had appeared anyway, offering refuge if I wanted it. The building seemed to be saying, you can keep driving if you want, but I'm here if you need me. I slowed down, considering my options. I could stop and wait out the aurora activity, play it safe like Hayes and the other experienced drivers recommended. Or I could push through, document what I was experiencing, try to learn more about how the aurora mile worked. In the end, I kept driving, not because I was brave, but because I needed to know. Needed to understand what I was dealing with, whether the effect was consistent or if it varied based on aurora intensity or some other factor I hadn't identified yet. Mile marker 303 appeared, marking the south end of the aurora mile. I passed it and continued south, and immediately the feeling of wrongness lifted. The GPS snapped back to its normal update rate. The CB static cleared, and the landscape looked fully normal again. I'd made it through without incident. No loops, no phantom trucks, no impossible geometry. Just a faint sense of displacement and some minor technical glitches that could easily be explained by aurora-induced electromagnetic interference. Maybe the effect really was tied to aurora intensity. Maybe the moderate display wasn't strong enough to create the major reality distortions. Or maybe I'd just gotten lucky this time. I continued south to Fairbanks, dropped my load, and immediately got dispatched for another run north. This time, I'd be traveling through the aurora mile during the day, with full sunlight and no aurora activity at all. That would be a good test. If the effect was purely aurora-related, then daytime runs should show nothing unusual. The daytime run was completely normal, I drove through the Aurora Mile at 2 p.m. under clear skies, and it felt like any other stretch of the Dalton. The mile markers were spaced correctly, the GPS worked perfectly, and there was no sense of wrongness or displacement. Just regular road through regular landscape. So the effect definitely required Aurora activity. But was that all it required? Or were there other factors? Time of day, season, specific weather conditions, individual driver susceptibility, that determined when the Aurora Mile would manifest its strange properties. Over the next 3 months, I made 24 runs through that section of road, deliberately scheduling trips to coincide with predicted Aurora activity. I kept detailed logs of every trip: Aurora intensity, time of day, weather conditions, any unusual experiences or sensations. What I learned was both fascinating and terrifying. The Aurora Mile wasn't consistently dangerous. Most trips through it were completely normal, even with strong Aurora activity. But about 1 in every 5 or 6 trips, when conditions were right, things would start to get strange. The warning signs were always the same: CB static with voices underneath, GPS lagging or freezing, mile markers that looked slightly out of focus. That feeling of wrongness in the cab. When those signs appeared, I'd slow down immediately, start looking for Franklin's waypoint, and prepare to either wait out the Aurora or navigate carefully through whatever effects might develop. 3 times during those 3 months I had to stop at Franklin's waypoint and wait. Each time, there were other drivers there, some I recognized from previous stops, some I'd never seen before. We'd sit around the barrel stove, drinking coffee and sharing stories, waiting for the Aurora to die down before continuing our routes. And twice during those 3 months, I got caught in minor loops. Not the extended multi-hour experience I'd had that first time, but brief cycles lasting 10 or 15 minutes where I'd drive through the same few miles multiple times before the road would release me and I could continue normally. I learned to recognize when the loop was starting. The GPS would freeze completely, the mile markers would start appearing in the wrong order, and the CB voices would become more insistent, repeating the same numbers over and over. When that happened, I'd follow Hayes' advice. Close my eyes partially, drive by feel using the rumble strips to guide me, and trust that the road would eventually let me through. It always did. Eventually. But each time I got caught in a loop, I'd burn fuel at that same impossible rate, consuming a full tank to travel just 24 miles. And each time, my logbook would show hours of driving time with location stamps that jumped around nonsensically. My dispatcher started asking questions about the fuel consumption and the logbook anomalies. I told him it was GPS errors, equipment malfunctions, Aurora interference. He seemed satisfied with that explanation, but I could tell he didn't fully believe it. Other drivers started to recognize me at truck stops along the Dalton. "You're the guy who's studying the Aurora Mile," they'd say. Some of them would share their own experiences, adding to my collection of data. Others would just nod knowingly and wish me luck. I compiled everything into a document: every trip log, every strange experience, every story shared by other drivers. I noted patterns and correlations, tried to identify the specific conditions that triggered the most severe effects. But the more data I collected, the more mysterious it became. There was no clear pattern. Sometimes strong Aurora would create major effects. Sometimes none at all. Sometimes the effects would appear during twilight. Sometimes in full darkness. Sometimes they'd last for hours, sometimes just minutes. The only consistent factor was the location, always between mile markers 303 and 327, never anywhere else on the Dalton. And Franklin's waypoint, appearing when needed, offering refuge from the strangeness. 6 months after my first experience in the Aurora Mile, I was making another run north when I saw something that changed my understanding of everything. It was around 11 p.m., with a moderate aurora display lighting up the sky. I was approaching mile marker 315 when I saw a truck ahead of me, pulled over on the shoulder with its flashers on. This wasn't unusual. Drivers pull over for all sorts of reasons, from checking loads to taking breaks to dealing with the mechanical issues. But something about this truck bothered me. It looked old, like something from 20 or 30 years ago, and it seemed somehow faded, like I was looking at it through a filter or a fog. I slowed down and pulled up behind it, intending to check if the driver needed help. As I got closer, I could see the truck more clearly. It was a late 80s Kenworth, with paint schemes and accessories from that era, and sitting in the cab was a driver, visible in silhouette against the aurora light. I put on my flashers and climbed down from my cab, walking forward toward the other truck. But as I got within maybe 20 feet, I realized something was very wrong. The truck wasn't quite solid. I could see through it slightly, could see the landscape behind it showing through the metal and glass like it was translucent. And the driver in the cab wasn't moving, wasn't looking at me or acknowledging my presence, just sitting there, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. I stopped walking, my heart pounding. This wasn't a real truck. This was something else, an echo, maybe, or a recording of something that had happened years ago. A driver caught in the Aurora Mile at some point in the past, still frozen in time, still trapped in whatever loop or distortion had captured him. I backed away slowly, returning to my own truck. As I climbed back into the cab and pulled away, I watched the phantom truck in my mirrors. It sat there on the shoulder, flashers still blinking, that driver still frozen in position. And then, as I passed mile marker 310, it vanished. Just gone, like it had never been there at all. That night, I searched missing driver reports from the 1980s and 90s. I found one that matched. A driver named Marcus Sloan, no relation to me despite the shared last name, who disappeared in 1987 while traveling the Dalton. His truck had been found on the shoulder at mile marker 315 with the engine running and flashers on, but Marcus was nowhere to be found. I'd seen his truck, or, at least, I'd seen some kind of echo or recording of it, still sitting in the same spot where it had been found. And 35 years ago, the Aurora Mile wasn't just creating spatial distortions and time loops, it was preserving moments, capturing them and playing them back under the right conditions. How many other phantom trucks were out there, frozen in time between those mile markers? How many drivers were still trapped in loops they'd entered years or decades ago, their trucks visible to other drivers under the right aurora conditions? That question haunted me more than any of the other strange experiences. The idea that the Aurora Mile might not just disorient or loop drivers but actually trap them permanently in some kind of temporal distortion, that was terrifying on a level I couldn't fully process. I kept driving the Dalton, kept documenting my experiences, kept adding to my collection of data and stories. But I was more careful now, more aware of how dangerous the Aurora Mile could be. This wasn't just an interesting phenomenon or a puzzle to solve. This was something that could kill me, could trap me in a loop forever, could make me into another phantom truck that future drivers would see on the shoulder. A year after my first experience, I was making what would be my last run through the Aurora Mile. I didn't know it would be my last at the time, but looking back, I can see how all the warning signs were there. The Aurora forecast predicted a major display, the strongest in 5 years. Solar activity was at a peak, and the predictions showed aurora reaching as far south as Montana and North Dakota. Up in the Arctic, where the aurora was always visible during active periods, it was going to be spectacular. I should have waited, should have stayed in Fairbanks until the display was over. But I had a deadline, and the payment for this run was too good to pass up. So I loaded up and headed north, telling myself I'd just stop at Franklin's waypoint if things got too strange. I reached the Aurora Mile around 1 a.m., with the display already at full intensity. The entire sky was filled with light: green, red, purple, blue. Colors I'd never seen in an aurora before. The curtains moved faster than I'd ever witnessed, rippling and dancing like they were alive. The warning signs appeared immediately. CB static with voices, GPS freezing, mile markers out of focus. But this time they were more intense, more overwhelming. The voices on the CB were screaming, all talking over each other, giving mile markers in rapid succession. The GPS wasn't just lagging, it was showing my position jumping randomly across the map, sometimes placing me hundreds of miles away from the Dalton. And the mile markers themselves were wrong, not just out of focus, but actually displaying different numbers. I'd pass a marker that should say 320, but it would show 315 or 310 or 327. The numbers changed as I watched them, flickering between different values like they couldn't decide which number they were supposed to display. I started looking for Franklin's waypoint, but I couldn't find it. The stretch of road where it should be appeared empty. No building visible, no refuge available. The aurora was too strong, overwhelming everything, making it impossible to find safety. I kept driving because stopping would be worse. Kept my eyes on the immediate road, used the rumble strips to guide me. Tried to block out the sensory chaos of the aurora display overhead. The loop started almost immediately. I passed mile marker 303, then 327, then 315, then 303 again. The GPS was useless, showing me in a dozen different locations simultaneously. My fuel gauge was dropping rapidly, burning through diesel at an impossible rate. And then I started seeing the phantom trucks. Not just one, but dozens of them, all parked on the shoulder or driving alongside me. Trucks from different eras, different decades, all frozen in this section of road, all trapped in their own loops. I saw Marcus Sloane's truck again. I saw others I didn't recognize. I saw trucks that looked modern, recent models, and realized with horror that some of them might be from this year, this month. Drivers who'd gotten caught in the Aurora Mile recently and were already trapped, already becoming phantoms. The voices on the CB changed. Instead of just giving mile markers, they were calling out names now, including mine. Archer Sloane, Archer Sloane, mile 315, Archer Sloane. I was becoming part of it. The Aurora Mile was trying to capture me, to add me to its collection of trapped drivers and phantom trucks. I don't remember making the decision to go off-road. Don't remember seeing a gap in the landscape or choosing a direction. One moment I was on the pavement, the next, I was driving across the tundra, the truck bouncing and lurching over frozen ground. The aurora light was blinding, so intense I couldn't see anything except colored light. My headlights were useless against it. I was driving blind, guided only by instinct and desperation, and then everything went white. Not aurora light, but just white. Complete absence of color or form or substance. Like driving through an absolute void where nothing existed except my truck and the immediate space around it. I don't know how long I drove through that whiteness. Could have been seconds, could have been hours. Time had no meaning in that place. Distance had no meaning. I just kept the throttle steady, kept the wheel centered, and trusted that eventually I'd come out somewhere real. When the whiteness faded and I could see again, I was back on the Dalton Highway. But I was south of mile marker 303, well clear of the Aurora Mile. The Aurora display overhead had diminished to normal levels, and everything looked and felt completely normal. I stopped the truck and sat there shaking for several minutes. My fuel gauge showed empty. I'd burned through the entire tank. My clock showed 6:15 a.m., which meant I'd been in the Aurora Mile for over 5 hours. But it had felt both longer and shorter than that, like time had been compressed and expanded simultaneously. My logbook was corrupted, showing nothing but error messages for the entire night. The GPS had rebooted itself and was slowly reacquiring satellites, and my CB radio had physically burned out. The unit was warm to the touch, and smoke had come from the speaker when I'd finally emerged from the whiteness. I coasted to the nearest fuel stop on my remaining momentum and fumes. While the truck was refueling, I called my dispatcher and told him I was done with the Dalton, done with the Aurora Mile, done with everything north of Fairbanks. He tried to argue. I was one of his most reliable drivers for the northern runs. But I was firm. What I'd experienced that night had crossed a line. I'd come too close to becoming one of those phantom trucks, too close to being trapped forever in a loop between mile markers 303 and 327. That was 3 years ago. I still drive truck, but I stick to routes in the lower 48 now. Warmer climate, better roads, no Aurora displays to worry about. It's boring compared to the Dalton, but boring is safe. Sometimes I think about the Aurora Mile. Wonder if it's still doing what it did. Still catching drivers who aren't careful enough or who push their luck too far. I check missing person reports from Alaska occasionally, and every year there's still 1 or 2 drivers who vanish on the Dalton Highway. Search and rescue finds their trucks, but not the drivers. And I wonder about Franklin's Waypoint. Wonder if it's still there, still offering refuge to drivers who need it. Wonder if the people I met there, Hayes and Briggs and Dalton, were real people, or if they were something else. Phantoms themselves, maybe, trapped in that space between normal road and Aurora Mile distortion. I've never told this story to anyone who wasn't a trucker. Regular people wouldn't understand, would think I was crazy or making it up. But other drivers, especially those who've run the Dalton, they understand. They've experienced their own version of the strangeness, even if they don't talk about it openly. The Aurora Mile is real. It's there between mile markers 303 and 327 on the Dalton Highway, and under the right conditions, strong aurora, specific times, factors we don't fully understand, it becomes something more than just a road. It becomes a place where the normal rules don't apply, where space and time fold in on themselves, where drivers can get trapped in loops they might never escape. If you ever find yourself driving the Dalton during strong aurora activity, remember this. If things start to feel wrong, if your GPS freezes and your CB fills with static, if the mile markers stop making sense, find Franklin's Waypoint and wait it out. Don't try to push through. Don't think you can outsmart it or understand it. Because the Aurora Mile doesn't care about your schedule or your confidence or your experience. It doesn't care about anything. It's just there, doing what it does, waiting for the next driver who makes the mistake of thinking they can handle whatever it throws at them. I survived it, barely, but I left something of myself in that place. Some piece of certainty about how the world works, some comfortable assumption that reality is solid and consistent. The Aurora Mile taught me that reality is more fragile than we want to believe, that there are places and conditions where it breaks down completely. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving under a normal sky on a normal highway, I'll see aurora light reflecting off distant clouds. Just a faint green glow on the horizon. Nothing compared to the displays I witnessed on the Dalton. But it's enough to make me remember those hours in the Aurora Mile, enough to make me check my mirrors for phantom trucks that aren't there. I survived, but I'm not the same person who started driving the Dalton 9 years ago. The Aurora Mile changed me, showed me things that shouldn't be possible, forced me to accept that the world is stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. And every time I see that green glow in the sky, I remember the voices on the CB calling my name. Remember the whiteness that surrounded my truck when I finally broke free. Remember the phantom truck still trapped on that stretch of road, still driving their loops, still waiting for release that might never come. The Aurora Mile is still there, still catching drivers who aren't careful, still adding to its collection of trapped vehicles and lost souls. I got out. I was lucky, but luck runs out eventually, and the Aurora Mile is patient. It'll be there long after I'm gone, waiting for the next driver who thinks they can handle it, waiting for the next strong Aurora display, waiting to fold the road in on itself one more time. Don't drive the Aurora Mile when the lights are strong, and if you do, if you have no choice, pray that you'll find Franklin's Waypoint. Because that small building with the barrel stove and the warm coffee might be the only thing standing between you and permanent residence in a place where time and space don't work right. I've said what I needed to say, told my story. Whether anyone believes it or not doesn't matter to me anymore. I know what I experienced, know what I saw, know how close I came to never coming back. The Aurora Mile is real. And if you ever find yourself driving through it, you'll understand why some of us choose to never go back. My name is Cole Briggs, and I've been hauling freight across Alaska for 6 years. That might not sound like a long time compared to some of the veterans who've been running these roads since the pipeline days, but 6 years in Alaska is different from 6 years anywhere else. Up here, every season tests you in ways that'll either make you a better driver or send you packing back to the lower 48. I drive for a mid-sized outfit based out of Anchorage, mostly doing runs between the major cities and the remote communities scattered across the state. Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay, Anchorage to Nome, occasionally down to the Kenai Peninsula when they need someone reliable. The pay is good because the work is hard and the conditions are brutal, especially in winter when the temperatures drop so low that steel becomes brittle and diesel turns to jelly if you're not careful. The run that changed everything started on a Wednesday in early March. I was scheduled to haul mining equipment from Fairbanks up to a site near Galena, about 270 miles northwest. It's not the longest haul in Alaska, but it's one of the more challenging ones because about half the route is on secondary roads that don't get the maintenance attention of the major highways. The weather forecast that morning was marginal. A low-pressure system was moving in from the Bering Sea, bringing snow and wind with it. Not unusual for March in Alaska, but enough to make you think twice about heading out. My dispatcher, a guy named Morton, who'd been with the company for 20 years, left the decision up to me. "Forecast shows the worst of it hitting tonight," he said over the phone. "If you leave now, you should be able to get most of the way there before conditions deteriorate. But if you want to wait until tomorrow, I can push the delivery back a day." I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. The mining company needed the equipment, and waiting a day meant losing money for both them and my company. Plus, I'd driven through plenty of winter storms before. As long as you're careful and you don't push your luck, you can handle just about anything Alaska throws at you. That's what I thought anyway. That's what 6 years of experience had taught me. But Alaska has a way of reminding you that experience only counts for so much, that there's always something new to learn, usually the hard way. I loaded up just after noon, securing the equipment in my trailer with extra straps because I knew the wind could get pretty fierce on the exposed sections of road. The Kenworth was running smooth. I'd just had the engine serviced the week before, and I'd installed new winter tires that would give me better traction on ice and packed snow. The first 100 miles went exactly as planned. I took the Elliott Highway out of Fairbanks, heading west toward Manly Hot Springs, as before turning north. The road was clear, traffic was light, and I made good time. The sky was overcast, that flat gray color that promises snow but hasn't delivered yet, and the temperature was holding steady around -15. Around 3 p.m., I stopped at a small truck stop near Minto to fuel up and grab coffee. There were only two other vehicles in the lot, a pickup truck and another semi that looked like it had seen better days. Inside, the place was warm and smelled like old coffee and fried food, familiar and comforting after hours on the cold road. The clerk behind the counter was an older native woman I'd seen on previous runs. She glanced at me and then looked out the window at my truck. "You heading north?" she asked. "Northwest, Galena." She nodded slowly. "Storm's coming in faster than they predicted. You might want to think about stopping here for the night." I appreciated the concern, but I still had 3 or 4 hours of driving ahead of me, and I wanted to get as far as possible before the weather turned bad. "I'll be fine," I told her. "I've driven through worse." She gave me a look that I couldn't quite read. Not judgmental, but maybe sad, like she'd heard that same confidence from other drivers before and knew how those stories sometimes ended. "Be careful out there," she said. "Roads get strange in weather like this." I paid for the coffee and fuel, thanked her for the advice, and got back on the road. The sun was already low on the horizon, and I knew I'd be driving in darkness soon. That was fine. I preferred night driving sometimes. Less traffic, more focus on the immediate task of keeping the truck moving safely forward. The snow started about an hour after I left the truck stop. Just light flurries at first, the kind that melts on your windshield before the wipers can even push it away. But within 20 minutes it had intensified into a steady snowfall that reduced visibility to maybe 100 yards. I slowed down, turned on my clearance lights, and settled in for a careful drive through deteriorating conditions. My GPS unit had been acting a little strange all day, taking longer than usual to acquire satellites, occasionally losing signal for a few seconds before reconnecting. I'd noticed it that morning but hadn't thought much about it. GPS glitches weren't uncommon in Alaska, especially with weather systems moving through. As long as I knew the general route and had my paper maps as backup, I'd be fine. Around 5 p.m., with full darkness and heavy snow, the GPS chimed with a notification. I glanced at the screen and saw a message I'd never seen before. "Alternative route available. Save 45 minutes." The screen showed my current route highlighted in blue and an alternate route in green, branching off to the right about 2 miles ahead. According to the GPS, the alternate route was a more direct path to Galena, cutting across what looked like wilderness instead of following the longer curve of the maintained road. I was skeptical immediately. GPS units sometimes suggested routes that looked shorter on the map but were actually worse in real conditions. Unmaintained roads, seasonal routes that were impassable in winter, or private property where commercial trucks weren't allowed. I'd learned to trust my own knowledge of the area over what the GPS recommended. But this route was intriguing. If it really could save me 45 minutes, that would get me to Galena before the worst of the storm hit. And the map showed it as a proper road, not just a trail or track. It was marked as Galena Hall Road, Winter Access, which suggested it was designed specifically for heavy vehicles in winter conditions. I pulled over to the shoulder and studied the GPS more carefully. The alternate route split off from my current road and ran almost straight north for about 30 miles before reconnecting with the main route near Galena. It looked legitimate, showed proper road markings, and even had mile markers indicated along its length. I also pulled out my paper map and tried to find the road on it. But this was where things got confusing. My map didn't show any road in that location. According to the paper map, the area where the GPS showed the haul road was just wilderness. No roads, no settlements, nothing but forest and frozen rivers. That should have been my first warning. When your paper map and your GPS disagree, trust the paper map. GPS databases can have errors, can show roads that used to exist but have been closed, can sometimes display private or restricted routes that aren't available for public use. But I was tired. The storm was getting worse, and the idea of saving 45 minutes was appealing. I told myself that maybe this was a new road that hadn't been added to my older paper maps yet. Maybe it was a winter-only route that wasn't marked on summer maps. There could be legitimate reasons why the GPS showed it and my map didn't. I made my decision. I'd take the turnoff and check out this alternate route. If it looked too rough or poorly maintained, I could always turn around and backtrack to the main road. But if it was legitimate, I'd save significant time and get to Galena before conditions got any worse. 2 miles later, the turnoff appeared in my headlights exactly where the GPS said it would be. There was a gap in the trees on the right side of the road, and I could see what looked like a snow-covered road leading away into the darkness. There was no sign marking the turnoff, no indication of where the road led, but the opening was clearly large enough for a semi-truck. I slowed to a crawl and turned onto the side road, my headlights sweeping across untouched snow. The surface looked smooth and relatively level, and I could see 2 faint parallel tracks in the snow, evidence that another vehicle had been through here recently. That was reassuring. If someone else had used this road, it probably meant it was passable. The road led into a dense section of spruce forest, the trees forming walls on either side that blocked most of the wind. The snow wasn't as heavy here under the canopy, and my visibility actually improved slightly. I checked the GPS, and it showed me centered on the alternate route, with a straight line ahead for the next 15 miles. For the first few miles, everything seemed fine. The road was rough but navigable, with a surface that felt like packed snow over gravel. There were no potholes or major obstacles, and I was able to maintain a steady 25 miles per hour. Not fast, but respectable for an unmaintained winter road. I noticed the tire tracks I'd seen at the turnoff continued ahead of me. They looked relatively fresh, probably made within the last day or two, before the new snow had covered them. I found myself following them, using them as a guide to stay centered on the road. Whoever had driven through here before had made the same turns and avoided the same potential hazards. Around the 5-mile mark, I passed what looked like an old maintenance shed on the left side of the road. It was a small metal building, half buried in snowdrifts, with no lights or signs of recent use. The structure looked abandoned, like it had been sitting there for years without maintenance. But its presence suggested that this road had been official at some point, that there had been infrastructure to support traffic. The GPS continued showing my progress along the alternate route, with regular updates about my position and estimated arrival time in Galena. According to the unit, I'd save even more time than originally estimated, 52 minutes instead of 45. Whatever concerns I'd had about taking this route were fading. It seemed like I'd made the right call. But then, around mile 8, I noticed something strange about the tire tracks I'd been following. They weren't continuing straight ahead the way they should have been. Instead, they seemed to be getting narrower, like the vehicle that made them was somehow getting smaller. Or like the tracks themselves were fading, being erased by something other than new snowfall. I slowed down and watched the tracks carefully. Over the next quarter mile, they became progressively fainter, until finally, at a point marked by nothing special, just another stretch of forest road indistinguishable from the miles before it, the tracks disappeared completely. Not covered by snow, not turning off the road, just gone, like the vehicle that had made them had simply stopped existing at that exact spot. I stopped my truck and sat there idling, staring at where the tracks ended. There were dozens of possible explanations. Maybe the other vehicle had turned around at this point and gone back. Maybe wind had blown snow over the tracks ahead, but not behind. Maybe I was just tired and my eyes were playing tricks on me in the darkness and snow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Those tracks had been clear and consistent for 8 miles, and then they'd just stopped. Not gradually faded, but disappeared abruptly, like someone had drawn a line and said, "This is where the tracks end." I should have turned around right then. Should have backed up carefully until I found a spot wide enough to turn my rig around, then headed back to the main road. But I was already 8 miles in, and my GPS was still showing this as a legitimate route. Turning back would mean losing 30 or 40 minutes, maybe more in these conditions. And I was curious. What could have happened to the vehicle that made those tracks? Had they gotten stuck and been pulled out by a recovery vehicle that came from the opposite direction? Had they found a better route through the forest that my headlights weren't picking up? I decided to continue for another mile or two. If conditions got worse, or if I saw anything else concerning, I'd turn back. But for now, I'd keep moving forward on this strange winter road that my GPS insisted was the fastest way to Galena. The road continued straight and level for the next mile, with no tracks to follow now. I watched the tree line carefully, looking for any indication that another vehicle had turned off somewhere, but the snow on both sides of the road was undisturbed. Whatever had made those tracks, it had definitely ended its journey at that spot 8 miles back. The storm was intensifying now. Even under the protection of the trees, the snowfall was getting heavier, and the wind was picking up. My headlights caught swirling patterns in the air as the snow was pushed around by gusts that found their way through the forest canopy. Around mile 10, I noticed another strange thing. The mile markers that the GPS showed on its display weren't visible on the actual road. Usually, winter haul roads have some kind of physical markers, reflective posts or signs that help drivers track their position. But this road had nothing, just the unbroken tree line on both sides and the snow-covered surface stretching ahead into darkness. I checked my odometer against the GPS position. They matched correctly, which meant the GPS was tracking my movement accurately. But the absence of physical markers bothered me. It suggested this road wasn't as official or well-maintained as the GPS database indicated. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, plenty to reach Galena even if this route ended up being longer than advertised. My engine was running smooth, temperature normal, no warning lights on the dashboard. Everything mechanical was fine. It was just the situation itself that felt increasingly wrong. At mile 12, the forest opened up slightly, and I found myself driving across what looked like a frozen river or lake. The ice was thick and solid, with several feet of snow packed on top of it, but I could tell from the way the landscape flattened out that I was on water rather than land. This was common enough on Alaska winter roads. Many seasonal routes used frozen rivers as bridges, taking advantage of the natural highways created by waterways. The ice could support tremendous weight, easily enough for loaded semi-trucks, as long as the temperature stayed cold and you didn't stop in one place too long. But as I drove across the ice, I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. About 100 feet to my left, barely visible in the darkness and blowing snow, I could see what looked like another set of tire tracks. These ones weren't on the road I was following. They were off to the side, running parallel to my route but separated by about 50 yards of untouched snow. As I watched, the parallel tracks curved away from the road, heading off at an angle toward the far shore of the frozen river. And then they just stopped, the same way the tracks I'd been following earlier had stopped. No explanation, no indication of why or how, just an abrupt end in the middle of the frozen surface. I accelerated slightly, suddenly very eager to get off the ice and back onto solid ground. Frozen rivers were safe if you crossed them quickly and didn't linger, but they always made me nervous. The thickness of the ice was never quite as certain as you wanted it to be, and the thought of breaking through and sinking into frigid water was the stuff of nightmares. The road climbed up onto the far shore, and I was back in the forest surrounded by trees again. I checked my GPS. 15 miles down, 15 to go before I rejoined the main road. Halfway through this alternate route, and despite the strange details I'd noticed, I'd made decent time. Another 40 minutes or so and I'd be back on familiar roads. The GPS chimed again, this time with a different notification. Heavy snow ahead. Consider alternative route. I stared at the screen, confused. I was already on an alternative route. What was the GPS suggesting now? An alternative to the alternative? I tapped the screen to see more details, but the notification had already disappeared, replaced by the normal navigation display showing my position on the Hall Road. The snow was definitely getting heavier now. My wipers were working constantly, pushing away the accumulating snow, and even on high speed, they could barely keep the windshield clear. Visibility had dropped to maybe 50 feet, just enough to see the immediate road ahead and the first few rows of trees on either side. This was approaching whiteout conditions, where the falling snow becomes so thick that it's impossible to distinguish between sky and ground, where your depth perception fails and you can't tell if you're going uphill or down, turning or straight. I'd driven through a few whiteouts in my career, and they were terrifying experiences that I had no desire to repeat. I slowed down to 15 miles per hour, focusing intently on the immediate road surface. The trees provided some reference points, helping me maintain my sense of direction and orientation. As long as I could see the tree line, I could avoid complete spatial disorientation. But then, gradually, the trees started to thin out. Over the course of the next mile, the dense forest gave way to more open terrain, with increasing gaps between the spruces and eventually just scattered vegetation. And with the loss of the tree line came the loss of my visual anchors. I was driving into a whiteout. The snow was so thick now that I couldn't see anything beyond my headlight beams, and even those were just creating a wall of white light that reflected back into my eyes. The world outside my cab had disappeared, replaced by an undifferentiated white void. I stopped the truck. Continuing in these conditions was suicide. I couldn't see the road, couldn't tell if I was driving straight or turning, couldn't gauge my distance from potential hazards. Better to sit here with my flashers on and wait for the storm to ease than to drive blind into God knows what. I put the transmission in neutral, set the parking brake, and left the engine running to keep the cab warm. Then I settled in to wait, knowing that whiteouts could last anywhere from a few minutes to several hours, depending on the wind and snow intensity. The temperature outside was dropping fast, minus 25 according to my external thermometer, and probably colder with the wind chill factor. Inside the cab it was warm and comfortable, and I had my sleeping bag and emergency supplies if I needed to spend the night here. Not ideal, but safe enough. I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising in this remote area. I tried my CB radio, hoping to reach any other drivers who might be in the area, but all I got was static. The storm was creating too much interference for clear communication, so I sat there in the warmth of my idling truck, surrounded by white nothing, waiting for the storm to pass and wondering whether I'd made a terrible mistake by taking this alternate route. I sat there for what my clock told me was 40 minutes, but felt like hours. Time moves strangely when you're suspended in whiteness with nothing to look at except the constant swirl of snow in your headlight beams. I tried to stay alert, tried to keep my mind occupied, but there's only so much you can think about when you're trapped in a truck cab in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard. The storm should have been easing by now. According to the forecast, this was supposed to be a fast-moving system. Heavy snow for a couple of hours, then clearing. But if anything, the conditions seemed to be getting worse. The wind was stronger, rocking my trailer slightly, and the snow was so dense that I couldn't even see my hood ornament anymore. I was starting to seriously consider my options. I could sit here and wait, burning fuel to keep the engine running and the cab heated. I had maybe half a tank left, which would last through the night if I was careful. Or I could try to turn around, carefully backing up until I found a place wide enough to turn the rig, then drive back to the main road. That would be risky in zero visibility, but might be safer than continuing forward on a route I didn't trust. I was leaning toward the second option, turn around and get back to familiar territory, when my GPS chimed again. I looked at the screen and saw another notification. Route conditions improved, safe to proceed. That made no sense. I couldn't see anything outside except white. How could route conditions have improved? I tapped on the notification to get more details, and the GPS displayed a message I'd never seen from any navigation unit before. Visual conditions poor. Route integrity maintained. Continue forward. Route integrity maintained. What did that even mean? GPS units didn't assess route integrity. They showed you where to drive, but they didn't evaluate whether the road was actually safe or passable. I should have ignored it. Should have trusted my own judgment over a malfunctioning GPS unit. But something about the message was compelling, almost insistent. The GPS seemed to be telling me that even though I couldn't see the road was still there, still safe to drive on if I trusted it. Against my better judgment, I released the parking brake and put the truck back in gear. I'd go slow, maybe 5 miles per hour, and I'd stop immediately if anything felt wrong. But I'd give the GPS the benefit of the doubt for another mile or two. I started rolling forward, using the slight vibration from the rumble strips on the shoulder to tell me if I was drifting off the road. In whiteout conditions, this was sometimes the only way to navigate. Rely on tactile feedback and instrument readings rather than visual cues. The GPS showed me moving along the route, my blue position dot progressing steadily toward the point where this haul road would rejoin the main highway. 16 miles down, 14 to go. I just needed to make it through this section, get back to roads I knew, and I'd be fine. But as I drove, something started to bother me about the snow itself. Even in whiteout conditions, there's usually some variation in the density of the snowfall. Moments when you can see a little farther, brief clearings when the wind shifts the snow around. But this was constant, uniform, like someone had surrounded my truck with a white curtain that maintained exactly the same opacity every second. And there was something else. The snow hitting my windshield didn't look quite right. It was too uniform, too consistent in size and shape. Real snowflakes are irregular, unique, varying in size and pattern. But the snow I was seeing looked almost manufactured, like it was computer-generated or artificial. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were just tired from staring into the whiteness for so long. But when I looked again, the snow still looked wrong. And now I was noticing other strange details. The way it seemed to fall in perfect vertical lines despite the wind. The way each flake looked identical to the ones around it. My CB radio crackled suddenly, making me jump. Through the static, I heard a voice. It was distorted and broken, but definitely human. "Turn off. Mistake. Go back." I grabbed the microphone. "This is Sooner Express on the Galena Hall Road. I'm reading you broken and distorted. Please repeat." More static, then fragments of words. "No Hall Road. Hasn't existed. 20 years. Go back. 20 years. What was this person talking about? The GPS showed this as an active route. I'd seen tire tracks from another vehicle. This road was clearly in use, even if it wasn't on my paper maps. I tried responding again, but the static overwhelmed everything, and then the CB went silent. I adjusted the squelch and tried different channels, but I couldn't raise anyone. Either the storm interference was too strong, or I was too far from any repeater stations to get clear signal. The GPS showed 18 miles complete, 12 remaining. I was past the halfway point now, closer to the far end of this route than to the beginning. Even if I wanted to turn around, it would take longer to backtrack than to continue forward. I was committed now, whether I liked it or not. The whiteout continued for another mile. And then, gradually, it started to clear. The snow lightened, the wind dropped, and I could see shapes forming in the darkness ahead. The world was coming back into focus, emerging from that uniform white void. What I saw when visibility returned made me hit the brakes immediately. I was no longer on a road, or at least not on anything that looked like a maintained winter haul route. I was driving on ice. Flat, smooth ice that stretched ahead for at least a mile. And on either side of me, instead of forest or riverbanks, there was just nothing. Open space disappearing into darkness, with no visible boundaries or landmarks. I'd driven onto a frozen lake, a large one, from what I could see. But my GPS still showed me on the haul road, still indicated that I was following the correct route toward Galena. I stopped the truck and tried to assess the situation. The ice felt solid under my wheels. No cracking sounds. No sense of instability. It was clearly thick enough to support my weight, but I had no idea how I'd gotten here. No memory of leaving the forest road and transitioning onto a lake. Had I been so disoriented during the whiteout that I'd driven off the road without realizing it? That seemed impossible. I'd been using the rumble strips to guide me, and I would have felt it if I'd left the pavement or gravel surface and moved onto ice. Unless the road itself had led onto the ice. Maybe the haul road used this frozen lake as part of its route, the same way it had used the frozen river earlier. That would make sense. It would explain why my GPS still showed me on the correct path. But something about this didn't feel right. The ice stretched too far, too uniformly flat. There were no pressure ridges, no snowdrifts, no irregularities at all. It looked more like a manufactured surface than a natural, frozen lake. I checked my GPS again, and for the first time I noticed something strange about the display. The map background, the terrain features, the contour lines, the geographic details had changed. It no longer looked like the standard GPS mapping I was used to. Instead, it showed a simplified version of the landscape, with just the road marked in green and everything else as blank gray space. It was like the GPS had stopped trying to show me the real terrain and was just displaying an abstract representation of the route. Or like it was showing me what it thought should be there rather than what actually was there. I scrolled around on the map, trying to zoom out and get a better sense of where I was in relation to known landmarks. But when I tried to zoom out, the GPS wouldn't respond. It stayed locked at the same zoom level, showing just the immediate area around my position. This was getting worse by the minute. I was on a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere, following directions from a GPS unit that was acting increasingly strange, with no other traffic, no landmarks, no way to verify my actual position. The smart thing would be to stop right here and wait until daylight. In the morning, I'd be able to see where I actually was, could make informed decisions about whether to continue or find another way back to civilization. But the thought of sitting here on this ice for the next 6 or 7 hours, burning fuel and not knowing if the ice was safe for that long, was almost worse than continuing. I made my decision. I'd keep moving forward, but slowly and carefully. I'd watch for any signs of weak ice, discoloration, water seeping up through cracks, changes in the sound my tires made on the surface, and I'd be ready to stop or turn around at the first indication of danger. I started rolling forward again, my speed barely above idle. The ice was smooth and my tires found good traction, but I kept my movements minimal, avoiding any sudden turns or acceleration that might stress the surface. The GPS continued guiding me forward, the green route line stretching across the featureless gray background. According to the display, I had 10 miles remaining until I'd rejoin the main highway. 10 miles of driving across this frozen surface, and then I'd be back on familiar roads. I passed the 20-mile mark on this alternate route. My odometer confirmed the distance, matching what the GPS showed. Everything was working correctly from a technical standpoint. It was just the situation itself that made no sense. As I drove, I started noticing something moving on the ice far ahead of me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe a trick of the light and shadow. But as I got closer, I could see it more clearly. There was something on the ice, maybe a quarter-mile ahead, right in the path my GPS was directing me to follow. It looked like a vehicle. Another truck maybe, or possibly a large van or bus. It was dark and indistinct, but definitely vehicle-shaped. And it wasn't moving. It was just sitting there on the ice, directly in my path. I slowed down even further, approaching cautiously. Maybe this was the vehicle that had made the tire tracks I'd followed earlier. Maybe they'd gotten stuck or broken down, and I'd finally caught up to them. But as I got closer, within 100 yards, I started to see details that didn't make sense. The vehicle looked old. Not just old, but ancient. The body style was from decades ago, maybe from the 1970s or early 80s, one of those cab-over trucks that you rarely see anymore. And it was partially buried in the ice, like it had been sitting there for so long that the ice had formed around it. I stopped my truck about 50 feet away and sat there staring at this impossible vehicle. How could a truck from 40 or 50 years ago be sitting here on the ice? Had it broken through and then been frozen in place as the lake refroze around it? But if that had happened, the truck should be submerged, not sitting on the surface. I grabbed my flashlight and opened my door, intending to walk over and investigate. But the moment my foot touched the ice, I felt something wrong. The surface wasn't right. It was too smooth, too perfect. And when I tapped it with my boot, it made a sound that ice shouldn't make. A hollow, metallic sound, like I was standing on thin metal instead of frozen water. I pulled my foot back into the cab and looked at the surface more carefully. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see that what I'd thought was ice wasn't quite right. It was smooth and white, but it didn't have the texture or appearance of natural ice. It looked more like, I don't know how to describe it, like someone had painted the ground white or covered it with some kind of artificial material. The old truck ahead of me suddenly looked different too. Now that I was looking at it more carefully, I could see that it wasn't quite solid. There was something translucent about it, like I was looking at a photograph or a projection rather than an actual, physical object. This wasn't a frozen lake. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't a frozen lake. And that truck wasn't a real vehicle. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. My hands were shaking as I closed the door and put my truck back in gear. I needed to get out of here, needed to get off this strange white surface and back onto something real. But which direction should I go? Forward toward that phantom truck, or back the way I'd come? The GPS was still showing the route ahead as the correct path, but I couldn't trust the GPS anymore. It had led me here, to this impossible place where the ground wasn't ground, and trucks from the past sat frozen in positions they shouldn't be able to occupy. I made a split-second decision. I turned the wheel hard left, away from the route the GPS was showing, and started driving perpendicular to the direction I'd been traveling. If this was a lake, then eventually I'd reach a shore. If it was something else, well, I'd deal with that when I found out. The GPS immediately started recalculating, then displayed a new message. Leaving designated route. Return to route for continued navigation. I ignored it. The GPS had lost my trust. I was navigating by instinct now, driving away from the phantom truck and the impossible white surface, looking for anything that seemed more real. I drove in the new direction for maybe 5 minutes, maintaining slow speed, watching for any change in the terrain. And then, ahead of me, I saw something that gave me hope. There was a line of darkness stretching across the white surface. A shoreline, maybe, or at least a boundary between this strange white area and something else. As I approached the line, I could see it more clearly. It was indeed a shore, the edge of whatever this white surface was, and beyond it, the familiar sight of snow-covered ground and forest, real terrain, with trees and rocks and all the natural irregularities that had been absent from the artificial smoothness I'd been driving across. I crossed the boundary, and immediately everything felt different. The tires made the right sound rolling over packed snow. The landscape looked normal, with the natural variations in elevation and surface that you'd expect. And most importantly, I could see actual landmarks. Trees with distinct shapes, rock formations, the real details of a real place. I stopped the truck and just sat there for a minute, breathing hard, trying to process what I'd just experienced. I'd driven onto some kind of artificial surface, had seen a phantom truck that shouldn't exist, had felt the wrongness of a place that pretended to be nature, but was something else entirely. My GPS was going crazy, the screen flashing error messages and trying to recalculate. I turned it off completely, pulled out my paper map and tried to figure out where I actually was, but my map was no help. According to my odometer, I'd traveled 22 miles from the original turnoff. But when I looked at my map, there was no location 22 miles from that turnoff that matched what I was seeing. I should be in the middle of wilderness, miles from any roads. Yet I could see what looked like tire tracks in the snow ahead of me, suggesting that vehicles had been through here recently. Nothing made sense. The GPS had led me somewhere that didn't exist, and now I was somewhere that shouldn't be possible, and I had no idea how to get back to reality. I sat there in the darkness with my engine idling, trying to think rationally about an irrational situation. I'd made a decision to trust my GPS and take an alternate route, and that decision had led me to a place that defied explanation. Now I needed to make better decisions, ones based on what I could actually see and verify rather than what a malfunctioning GPS claimed. The tire tracks ahead of me were real. I could see them clearly in my headlights. 2 parallel lines pressed into the snow, leading away into the forest. They looked recent, maybe a day old, maybe less, and they meant that someone else had been through here, which meant there must be a way back to civilization. I decided to follow them. It was a simple plan, but it gave me something concrete to focus on. Follow the tracks, see where they lead, hope they eventually connect to a road I recognized. I started driving again, keeping my speed low and watching the tracks carefully. They led through the forest on what looked like an old logging road or service route. Narrow, rough, but passable for vehicles with decent clearance. My semi was pushing the limits of what this trail could accommodate, but I managed to thread through without getting stuck. The tracks were consistent, never varying or turning off. Whoever had driven through here had known exactly where they were going, had followed this route with confidence. That was reassuring. It suggested this was a real path, used by real people, not another phantom route like the GPS had shown me. After about 3 miles of careful driving through the forest, the trees started to thin out and I found myself on what looked like a more substantial road. Still unpaved, still covered in snow, but wider and more maintained than the trail I'd been following. And the tire tracks continued ahead, now joined by other tracks suggesting multiple vehicles had used this route. I breathed a sigh of relief. This looked like a legitimate road, the kind that remote communities in Alaska used to connect to larger highways. If I followed it long enough, I'd eventually reach somewhere with people, phones, and the ability to figure out where I actually was. My CB radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer. Any drivers on the North Service Road, be advised conditions are deteriorating. Recommend finding shelter. I grabbed the microphone. This is Sooner Express. I'm on what I think is a service road north of Galena. Can you confirm location? There was a pause. Then the voice came back, confused. Sooner Express? Did you say North Service Road? Affirmative. I took what I thought was the Galena Hall Road as an alternate route, but I'm not sure where I ended up. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, there is no North Service Road near Galena, and the Galena Hall Road was closed in 2003. It's been decommissioned for 20 years. 20 years. That matched what the other broken CB transmission had said earlier. This alternate route I'd taken wasn't an active road at all. It was an old, closed route that shouldn't have been in my GPS database, that shouldn't have been suggesting as a viable alternate path. "Copy that," I said into the microphone. "Can you help me figure out my current location? I need to get back to a main highway. What's your last known position before you took the turnoff?" I told him, giving the approximate coordinates and mile marker where I'd left the main road. There was silence on the other end, and I could imagine whoever was on the radio consulting maps, trying to figure out where I might have ended up. Finally, the voice came back. "Okay, if you turned where you said you did, and you've been driving roughly north for how many miles?" I checked my odometer. "About 25 miles total from the turnoff." "That doesn't make sense. There's nothing in that direction except wilderness. No roads, no structures, no way you could have driven 25 miles north from that point." But I had driven 25 miles. My odometer proved it, my fuel consumption proved it, the time that had passed proved it. I'd been driving for over 2 hours, had covered distance, had ended up somewhere. The fact that it shouldn't be possible didn't change the reality that it had happened. "I'm telling you, I'm here," I said. "I'm on some kind of road, following tire tracks from another vehicle. I need guidance on how to get back to civilization." There was more silence, and I could hear muffled conversation in the background, like multiple people were discussing my situation. Then the voice came back with instructions. "Okay, here's what you're going to do. Keep following that road. Eventually, you should intersect with Route 16 near Ruby. That's about 30 miles from where we think you might be. When you hit 16, turn south and follow it back to Galena. Can you do that?" Route 16. I knew that highway. It ran through central Alaska, connecting small communities to the larger road network. If I could find it, I'd be able to navigate back to familiar territory. "Copy that. I'll follow this road and look for Route 16. How will I know when I've reached it?" It's a paved highway, should be marked with signs. Can't miss it. "And driver, be careful. Whatever road you're on, it's not one we have in our database. You're in unmapped territory." Unmapped territory. That was a polite way of saying I was lost in a way that shouldn't be possible. That I'd somehow driven off the edge of the map and into spaces that didn't officially exist. I acknowledged the transmission and kept driving, following the tire tracks and the rough, unpaved road as it wound through the forest. The snow had stopped completely now, and the sky was starting to clear, showing patches of stars between the clouds. With the better visibility, I could see more of the surrounding terrain, and what I saw was both familiar and strange. The landscape looked like Alaska. Spruce forest, snow-covered ground, frozen streams, but something about it felt old. Not just geologically old, but temporally old, like I was looking at a version of Alaska from decades past. The trees seemed older, more gnarled. The few structures I passed, old hunting shacks, collapsed outbuildings, looked like they'd been abandoned for much longer than the years suggested. Around mile 30 from the original turnoff, I saw something that made me slow down and stare. On the right side of the road, partially hidden by snow and vegetation, was a sign. It was old and weathered, the paint faded, but still legible in my headlights. Galena Hall Road, mile 15. Authorized vehicles only. Road closes September 2003. 20 years ago, just like the voices on the radio had said. This road had been closed for 2 decades, marked as off-limits, presumably left to decay and be reclaimed by nature. But my GPS had shown it as an active route, had calculated time savings, had guided me onto it as if it were a legitimate alternative. I pulled over and got out of the cab, walking up to the sign for a closer look. The date was clear, September 2003, and there was additional text below it, partially obscured by weathering. Bridge failure at mile 22. Route permanently closed. Use Highway 9 for Galena access. Bridge failure at mile 22. I'd driven past mile 22 on this route. Had driven across that white surface that I'd thought was a frozen lake. Was that where the bridge failure had occurred? Had the bridge been replaced with ice? Or had something stranger happened at that location? I got back in my truck and continued driving, now understanding a little more about where I was. This was the old Galena Hall Road, a route that had been closed 20 years ago after a bridge failure. But somehow, my GPS had routing data for it, had suggested it as a viable alternate path, had guided me onto a road that shouldn't exist in any current navigation database. The tire tracks I'd been following continued ahead, which meant someone else had driven this route recently despite the closure. Maybe other drivers had made the same mistake I had, trusting their GPS and ending up on this decommissioned road. Or maybe there were people who knew about this route and used it anyway, taking advantage of a shorter path despite the official closure. Around mile 35, the road began to improve. The surface became smoother, the width increased, and I started seeing more signs of maintenance. And then, ahead in my headlights, I saw pavement. Real black asphalt, with painted lines and proper road markings. Route 16. I'd made it. I pulled onto the paved highway and stopped, just sitting there for a moment and appreciating the simple fact of being on a real road again. A road that was on my maps, that was properly maintained, that connected to other roads in a logical network. I was back in the normal world. I checked my fuel gauge, less than a quarter tank remaining. I'd burned through 3/4 of a tank to travel what should have been maybe 120 miles total. The math didn't work. I should have used maybe half a tank at most. But I'd learned not to expect things to make sense when it came to that alternate route. I turned south on Route 16, heading toward Galena, and tried my CB radio again. This time, I got a clear response immediately, confirming that I was where I thought I was, and giving me an estimated distance to the nearest fuel station. "You're the driver who got lost on that old Hall Road, right?" the voice on the radio asked. "That's me." "How was it? What did you see out there?" I thought about how to answer that question. What had I seen? A road that shouldn't exist, tire tracks that disappeared, a phantom truck frozen in impossible ice, a white surface that pretended to be natural but wasn't. How do you explain experiences that defy rational explanation? It was strange, I finally said. Not somewhere I'd recommend going. "We get 1 or 2 drivers every year who make that mistake," the voice said. "GPS units sometimes have old data, show roads that have been closed for years. Usually people turn around once they realize the road is unmaintained. You're one of the few who actually made it all the way through." One of the few. That implied others had tried and failed. I thought about those tire tracks that had disappeared, about the phantom truck on the white surface. Had those been other drivers who hadn't made it through, who'd gotten lost or stuck or worse? I reached the fuel station about 20 minutes later. A small independent operation that was barely more than a couple of pumps and a shed. But it had fuel, and that's all I needed. While my tanks were filling, I went inside and bought coffee and asked the attendant about the old Galena Hall Road. "Oh yeah, that road," he said, nodding knowingly. "Been closed forever, but some drivers still try to use it as a shortcut. Always ends badly." "How so?" He shrugged. Some get turned around and lost. Some run out of fuel before they make it through. A few years ago, we had a driver disappear completely. Search and rescue found his truck, but not him. Road's got a bad reputation now. Most locals avoid it entirely. Why would GPS units still show it as a viable route if it's been closed for 20 years? Database errors, I guess. Or maybe someone keeps updating the data, adding that route back in even though it's officially closed. There are conspiracy theories about it, people who think the road was closed for reasons other than bridge failure, that there's something out there the government doesn't want people to see. I thought about the white surface, about the way the GPS had shown a simplified map instead of real terrain data. Maybe those conspiracy theories weren't entirely wrong. Maybe there was something strange about that section of road, something that had prompted the closure. I finished fueling and paid for the gas and coffee. Before I left, the attendant gave me one more piece of advice. If you're filing a report about this, just say you got lost due to GPS error. Don't talk about anything strange you might have seen. People will think you're crazy, and it'll just complicate things. I thanked him and got back on the road, driving the remaining distance to Galena. By the time I arrived at the mining site to drop off my load, it was after midnight, way behind my original schedule, but at least I'd made it. The supervisor at the mine was understanding about the delay. GPS sent you down the old Hall Road, right? He asked, like it was a common problem. Yeah, that happens sometimes. Sorry about that. I wanted to ask him more questions, about what he knew about that road, about whether other drivers had reported strange experiences. But I was exhausted, and he was busy, and I just wanted to complete my delivery and find somewhere to sleep. I stayed in Galena for 3 days, waiting for a return load and using the time to rest and think about what I'd experienced. During those 3 days, I did some research on the old Galena Hall Road, trying to find out why it had really been closed and what had happened there over the years since. The official story was simple. A bridge had failed in 2003, making the route impassable, and the state had decided it wasn't worth the cost of repairs given that alternative routes existed. The road had been officially closed, barriers had been erected at the main access points, and over time it had been removed from most maps and GPS databases. But digging deeper, I found hints of a more complicated story. There had been incidents on that road even before the official closure. Drivers reporting navigation equipment failures, experiencing unusual time discrepancies, seeing things that shouldn't be there. None of it had been officially documented, just rumors and stories shared among drivers who'd used the route. The bridge failure itself was strange. According to the incident report I found, the bridge had been inspected just 2 weeks before it collapsed and had been deemed structurally sound. Then, on a clear day with no unusual weather or traffic, it had simply failed catastrophically, dropping into the river below. No explanation, no clear cause, just sudden failure. And after the closure, the incidents had continued. Drivers who accidentally or deliberately went around the barriers reported even stranger experiences than before. Vehicles that ran fine for years suddenly developing mysterious mechanical issues on that road. GPS units showing impossible locations. Time anomalies where drivers arrived at their destinations hours earlier or later than their travel time should allow. I found an online forum where drivers shared stories about the road. Most of the posts were years old. The forum itself seemed to have been abandoned around 2015, but they provided a consistent picture of a route that was more than just geographically challenging. One post in particular caught my attention. It was from 2007, from a driver who'd gone through the road after the closure. I don't know what that place is, but it's not just a road. It's like driving through somewhere that's half real and half something else. The further you go, the less real it feels. By the time I hit that section with no trees, I was sure I'd driven off the edge of the world into some kind of void. GPS said I was en route, but my eyes told me I was nowhere. That described my experience perfectly. The white surface that looked like ice but wasn't. The phantom truck. The feeling that I was driving through something that only pretended to be real. Another post from 2009. I think that road connects to somewhere it shouldn't. Like there's a fold in space or something, and driving that route takes you through the fold. You end up where you're supposed to be eventually, but you pass through something strange in between. A fold in space. That was a wild theory, but it made as much sense as anything else. Maybe the bridge failure in 2003 had been caused by something more fundamental than structural issues. Maybe something about that location made normal engineering and physics work differently. On my third day in Galena, I talked to an older driver who'd been running Alaska routes since the 1980s. His name was Dalton, same last name as the highway, and he'd heard the story of my GPS mishap. "You're lucky you made it through," he said. "That road, it's not meant for traffic anymore. Hasn't been for a long time. You ever drive it?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Once, back in '02, before it was officially closed. Even then it was strange. Had this feeling the whole time that I wasn't quite where I thought I was. Like the road existed in two places at once, and I was seeing both overlaid on top of each other. Do you know why it was really closed?" He looked at me carefully, like he was deciding how much to say. "Bridge failure was the excuse," he finally said. "But the real reason, the state did surveys of that area in 2002 and 2003. Found anomalies, magnetic, gravitational, things they couldn't explain. Nothing dangerous enough to warrant a full investigation, but unusual enough that they decided maybe it wasn't a good idea to have commercial traffic going through there regularly." "What kind of anomalies?" "The kind that make your instruments act strange, make time flow different, make your eyes see things that your brain insists can't be there." He shrugged. "Alaska's a big place with a lot of wilderness. There are spots that don't quite follow normal rules. Most of them are so remote nobody ever goes there. That haul road just happened to pass through one of them." I spent the rest of that afternoon talking with Dalton, and he introduced me to two other drivers who'd had experiences on or near the old haul road. One was a younger guy named Mason, who'd taken the route by accident in 2019, following his GPS just like I had. The other was a woman named Sloan, who worked for a different company but had heard enough stories about the road to avoid it completely. "I almost took it once," Sloan said. "About 4 years ago. GPS showed it as a shortcut, promised to save me an hour. But I'd heard the stories from other drivers, so I ignored the GPS and stayed on the main highway. Next day, I heard a driver from another company had gone down that route the same night and never made it to his destination." "What happened to him?" I asked. "Search and rescue found his truck 3 days later, parked on the ice of a frozen lake about 15 miles off where the road should have been. Engine was still running, but the driver was gone. They searched for weeks, brought in helicopters and search dogs, but never found any trace of him. It was like he'd just stepped out of his cab and vanished into thin air." Mason nodded in agreement. "I heard about that case. Driver's name was Parker something. State police eventually ruled it as voluntary disappearance, said he must have wanted to abandon his life, and the truck situation was just a coincidence. But anyone who knew the guy said that made no sense. He had a family, good job, no reason to disappear." I felt a chill hearing that name. Parker. The same name that had come up in some of the forum posts I'd read. How many Parkers had disappeared on or near that road? Was it one person whose story had been repeated and exaggerated over time? Or were there multiple drivers with that name who'd met similar fates? The thing about that road, Dalton continued, is that it doesn't treat everyone the same way. Some people drive through and experience minor weirdness, GPS glitches, time discrepancies, strange sights. They make it through confused but intact. But others go in and never come out, or come out changed somehow. Changed how? I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. I knew a driver back in 2005, guy named Hayes. He drove that route after it was closed. Didn't realize what it was until he was already committed. Made it through, like you did, but he was different after. Wouldn't talk about what he'd seen, but he started having these episodes where he'd lose time. Would be driving along and suddenly realize hours had passed that he couldn't account for. Eventually, had to stop driving altogether because the episodes got so bad. You think the road did that to him? I think something about that place gets inside your head, changes the way you perceive time, or reality, or something fundamental about how you navigate through the world. Most people shake it off eventually, but some don't. That evening, I went to the small library in Galena and spent several hours digging through their archives. They had old newspapers on microfiche going back to the 1970s, and I searched for any mentions of the Hall Road or incidents in that area. What I found was disturbing. The road itself had been built in 1979, part of a push to develop infrastructure for remote mining operations. From the very beginning, there had been problems. Construction crews reported equipment malfunctions, survey instruments giving inconsistent readings, and several workers claiming to see structures or landmarks that weren't there when they went to investigate. One article from 1981 detailed an incident where a construction supervisor had driven his truck off the partially completed road, insisting that he was following what looked like an older, pre-existing road that paralleled the construction route. The article quoted him as saying the old road looked more real than the one they were building. He'd been dismissed from the project, and the incident was attributed to exhaustion and heat exposure. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, there were scattered reports of incidents on the Hall Road. Vehicles found abandoned with no explanation. Drivers reporting time anomalies. A few cases where drivers arrived at their destinations but claimed to have no memory of large portions of the journey. Each incident was explained away individually. Driver error, medical issues, equipment malfunction, but taken together, they painted a picture of a route that had always been problematic. The 2003 bridge failure that officially closed the road had been investigated by state engineers. I found a summary of their report, and while most of it was technical, one paragraph caught my attention. Physical inspection revealed structural failure inconsistent with age, loading, or environmental factors. Metal components showed stress patterns suggestive of exposure to powerful magnetic fields, though no such fields were detected during investigation. Recommend closure and decommissioning pending further study. Magnetic fields. That matched what Dalton had said about the state surveys finding anomalies. But what could cause magnetic fields strong enough to stress steel bridge components? And why weren't those fields present when investigators went to examine the site? I found one more document that was particularly interesting. A memo from 2004 discussing whether to remove the closed road from GPS databases. The memo noted that several mapping companies had been contacted and asked to delete the route from their systems, but that the road continued to appear in various navigation databases despite repeated removal requests. Someone, or something, kept adding that road back into GPS systems, even after official requests to have it removed. That matched what my company's tech people had found. Database modifications that appeared without proper logging, routing data that manifested without anyone actually adding it. I made copies of everything I could find and returned to my hotel room feeling more disturbed than when I'd started. Every piece of information I uncovered made the situation stranger rather than clearer. This wasn't just a case of a poorly maintained road or outdated GPS data. There was something genuinely anomalous about that route, something that had been affecting people and equipment for decades. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the 6 hours missing from my logbook, about the white surface that wasn't ice, about the tire tracks that had disappeared. And I kept wondering about the other drivers who hadn't made it through, where they were now, what had happened to them during their journeys through that strange space. Around 2 a.m., unable to sleep, I got up and checked my email. There was a message from my dispatcher with the subject line, GPS Investigation Update. I opened it and found a more detailed report from the tech team that had analyzed my GPS unit. According to their findings, the routing data for the old Hall Road had been added to my GPS just 3 days before my trip, inserted during a routine software update. But the update had come from a server that didn't exist. The IP address traced back to a location in Alaska that had no telecommunications infrastructure, no buildings, nothing but wilderness. More disturbing was that when they'd tried to access the server again to investigate further, it was gone. The IP address no longer resolved to anything, as if it had never existed. And when they'd checked the logs of other GPS units in our fleet, they found that mine was the only one that had received the rogue update. I'd been specifically targeted. Something had wanted me to take that route, had modified my specific GPS unit to show me that road and encourage me to use it. But why? What was the purpose of luring drivers onto a closed route through anomalous terrain? The more I learned, the less sense any of it made. And the less sense it made, the more disturbing it became. I thought about the white surface, about the GPS showing simplified terrain instead of real mapping data. Maybe the GPS database hadn't been wrong or corrupted. Maybe it had been showing me the only representation of that area it could render, because the real geography was too strange to map accurately. When I finally got my return load and started the drive back to Anchorage, I made sure to take the main highways, the routes that I knew were well traveled and properly mapped. My GPS unit had been acting strangely ever since the trip through the Hall Road, occasionally freezing, sometimes showing phantom routes that didn't exist, but I'd learned not to trust it anyway. The drive back was uneventful, which was exactly what I wanted. Normal roads, normal conditions, normal navigation. By the time I reached Anchorage 3 days later, I'd almost convinced myself that the experience on the Hall Road had been exaggerated by fatigue and stress, that the strange things I'd seen had rational explanations I just hadn't figured out yet. But then I checked my logbook, the electronic system that recorded all my driving time and locations. It should have shown a straightforward record of my trip. Departure from Fairbanks, arrival in Galena, return to Anchorage, with all the stops and driving hours properly logged. Instead, there was a gap. The logbook showed me leaving Fairbanks and then nothing for 6 hours. Just blank space where data should have been. And then it picked up again with me on Route 16 near Ruby, as if I'd teleported from Fairbanks to that location without driving the distance between. The GPS data was even stranger. It showed my position jumping around randomly during those missing 6 hours, sometimes placing me hundreds of miles from where I'd actually been, sometimes showing coordinates that weren't even in Alaska, sometimes displaying positions that were just strings of numbers that made no geographic sense. I tried to rationalize it. Equipment malfunction, GPS errors, logbook glitches. But I knew better. The systems had recorded what they could of my journey through that space between normal roads, and what they'd recorded was incoherent because the space itself was incoherent. I submitted my paperwork to my company, and they flagged the logbook anomalies immediately. I had to explain to my dispatcher what had happened, how I'd ended up on a closed road for hours with no proper data recording. GPS told me to take an alternate route, I said. Didn't realize it was the old haul road until I was already committed to it. He looked at me suspiciously. GPS shouldn't be showing that route at all. That road's been out of the database for years. Well, mine showed it, and I followed it, and ended up spending 6 hours driving through terrain that apparently doesn't record properly on any equipment. You file an incident report? I nodded. I'd filled out all the required forms, documented everything I could remember, noted the equipment malfunctions and the strange conditions. But I'd left out the details that would make me sound crazy. The white surface that wasn't ice, the phantom truck, the feeling of driving through somewhere that only pretended to be real. Okay, he said. We'll get your GPS unit checked, make sure it's not pulling data from corrupted sources. And maybe you should take a few days off, get some rest. Long hauls in winter can be tough on everyone. I took his advice and took a week off. Spent time with my family, tried to relax, tried not to think about that alternate route and what I'd experienced there. But it stayed with me, nagging at my thoughts, making me question things I'd previously taken for granted about how the world worked. About 2 weeks after I'd returned to Anchorage, I got a call from my dispatcher. Hey Cole, got something interesting for you. Remember that GPS issue you had on the Galena run? Yeah? We sent your unit in for analysis. Tech guys found something in the routing database, a file that shouldn't have been there. Someone had manually added data for the old haul road, complete with time estimates and road conditions, dated just a few days before your trip. Someone added it? Who? That's the thing. They can't tell. The modification wasn't logged properly. No user ID attached to it, like it appeared in the database without anyone actually putting it there. I felt a chill run down my spine. What are you saying? I'm saying somebody, or something, wanted you to take that route. Whether it was a hacker playing games with our GPS systems, or, I don't know, something else. But it wasn't random. You were directed onto that road deliberately. I thought about the tire tracks I'd followed, about the other drivers who'd made the same mistake over the years. Had they all been deliberately directed there? Was something about that route drawing in travelers, luring them into that strange space? Have there been other incidents? I asked. Other drivers from our company ending up on that road? Not recently. You're the first in about 3 years. Before that, we had 2 drivers take the old haul road, both in 2020. Both reported similar equipment malfunctions and strange experiences. We flagged the route in our system after that. Should have made it impossible for any GPS unit to suggest it. But somehow, yours did anyway. I thanked him for the information and hung up. Then I did something I'd been avoiding. I searched for news about missing drivers in Alaska, specifically ones who'd disappeared near the area where the old haul road was located. I found 6 cases over the past 20 years. 6 drivers who'd vanished without explanation in that general region. Their trucks sometimes found abandoned, sometimes never found at all. The most recent case was from 2021. A driver hauling supplies to a remote mining operation who'd radioed his dispatcher saying he was taking a shortcut and was never heard from again. A shortcut. Just like I'd done, following GPS directions that promised saved time. Had that driver ended up on the old haul road? And if so, why had he disappeared while I'd made it through? I found one more piece of information that made the whole thing even more disturbing. In 2015, a journalist had written an article about the old Galena Haul Road, investigating the rumors and strange stories associated with it. She'd interviewed dozens of drivers, documented cases going back to the 1990s, and had even driven the route herself to see what was there. Her conclusion, published in a now-defunct Anchorage newspaper. Something about that section of road between mile 18 and mile 25 defies conventional explanation. Instruments malfunction, time behaves strangely, and drivers consistently report seeing things that shouldn't exist. Whether this is due to natural phenomenon, unusual magnetic fields, atmospheric conditions, or unknown geological features, or something else entirely, I cannot say. But I can confirm that the experiences are real, consistent across multiple independent witnesses, and unexplained by current scientific understanding. The article had been dismissed by most readers as sensationalism. The journalist herself had stopped writing about the topic after that single article, and when someone online had asked her why, she'd responded simply, "Some things are better left unexplored." I understood that sentiment now. I'd driven through that route, experienced its strangeness firsthand, and come out the other side with more questions than answers. And those questions didn't have satisfying conclusions. They just opened up into bigger mysteries, deeper uncertainties about the nature of roads and space and reality itself. 3 months later, I was offered another run to Galena. Same mining site, similar timeline, good pay. I accepted the job, but this time I planned my route carefully, making sure to stay on main highways the entire way. No shortcuts, no alternate routes, no trusting GPS over my own maps and knowledge. The trip went smoothly. Normal driving, normal conditions, normal everything. But when I reached the turnoff where I'd made my mistake before, I slowed down and looked at it carefully. The gap in the trees was still there, exactly as I remembered it. And in the snow, I could see fresh tire tracks turning off the main road and disappearing into the forest. Someone else had recently made the same choice I had, following GPS directions onto a route that shouldn't exist. I pulled over completely this time, put on my hazards, and got out of the cab. The temperature was around -20, cold enough to make breathing painful, but I needed to see those tracks up close, needed to confirm what I suspected. The tracks were fresh, maybe a day old, maybe less. They were from a heavy vehicle, probably another semi like mine, and they showed no hesitation at the turnoff, no indication that the driver had paused to consider whether this was a good decision. Just a smooth turn onto the side road and straight into the forest, following whatever guidance their GPS had provided. I stood there in the cold, staring at those tracks, and felt a wave of responsibility wash over me. Someone was out there right now, maybe driving across that white surface, maybe seeing that phantom truck, maybe experiencing the same disorientation and fear I'd felt. And there was nothing I could do to help them, no way to warn them or guide them back. I got back in my truck and sat with the engine idling for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. I could follow those tracks, try to catch up to the other driver, warn them about what lay ahead. But that would mean going back onto that road, subjecting myself to those anomalies again, risking getting trapped in that strange space. Or I could continue to Anchorage, file my report, hope that the other driver made it through safely like I had. In the end, I made the coward's choice. I pulled back onto the main highway and continued towards Anchorage, leaving whoever had made those tracks to their own fate. I told myself that they'd probably be fine, that most drivers who took that route made it through. But I knew I was rationalizing, knew I was choosing my own safety over the possibility of helping someone else. That guilt stayed with me for the entire drive back. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those fresh tracks turning into the forest. Every time I stopped for fuel or food, I checked the CB channels hoping to hear from the other driver, hoping for confirmation that they'd made it through safely. I never heard anything, and when I got back to Anchorage and checked with my dispatcher, There were no reports of missing drivers or incidents on that route, which meant either the other driver had made it through without problems, or they hadn't made it through at all and nobody had noticed yet. The next day, I went to the company office to submit my detailed incident report and have a follow-up meeting with my dispatcher about the GPS issues. The tech team had finished their analysis, and what they'd found was even more disturbing than what they'd told me over the phone. The routing data wasn't just added to your GPS, the tech explained. He was a young guy, probably in his mid-20s, who normally seemed confident but now looked unsettled. It was integrated into the system in a way that made it look like original manufacturer data, like the road had always been in there, part of the standard database. We only found it because we knew what to look for. And you're sure it came from that fake server, the one that doesn't exist anymore? That's the thing, he said. We're not actually sure it came from anywhere. The logs show the data being added, but they don't show a source. It's like the information just spontaneously appeared in your GPS unit. My dispatcher, Morton, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. That's not possible. Data doesn't just appear. Someone had to add it. I'm telling you what the logs show, the tech insisted. Or rather, what they don't show. There's no source, no transmission, no download event. The data is just there 1 second and not there the second before, with no record of how it got there. We sat in silence for a moment, all of us trying to process the implications of that. Finally, Morton asked the question we were all thinking. So, what are we dealing with here? Some kind of sophisticated hack? A bug in the system? I don't know, the tech admitted. I've been working with GPS systems for 6 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's like the road itself added its own data to the GPS. Which I know sounds crazy, but I don't have a better explanation. The road itself. I thought about the magnetic anomalies mentioned in that old engineering report, about the survey crews seeing structures that weren't really there, about decades of strange incidents. What if the tech's crazy-sounding explanation wasn't so crazy after all? What if something about that place, whatever anomaly existed there, was capable of affecting electronic systems, of making itself visible to navigation databases? Have you checked other GPS units in the fleet? I asked, to see if any others have the same data? We checked all of them, the tech said. Yours is the only one. But we also checked units from other companies, and we found something interesting. About 3% of commercial GPS units in Alaska have routing data for that closed road. Different companies, different models, different software versions. But all of them show the old haul road as a viable route. 3%. That meant dozens, maybe hundreds of GPS units across Alaska were showing drivers that closed route, luring them onto a road that led through anomalous terrain. How many drivers had followed those directions? How many had made it through? And how many hadn't? I spent the rest of that week in Anchorage, following up on the incident and trying to get answers. I contacted the Alaska State Troopers to ask about the driver whose fresh tracks I'd seen, but they had no record of any missing drivers or incidents on that date. Either the driver had made it through safely and continued on their route without reporting any problems, or they were still out there somewhere, maybe still driving through that endless white space. I also tried to contact the journalist who'd written the article about the haul road back in 2015. It took some searching, but I eventually found her contact information and sent her an email describing my experience and asking if she knew anything more about the road's anomalies. She responded 2 days later. Mr. Briggs, I appreciate you sharing your story, but I stopped investigating that road years ago for good reason. Some places aren't meant to be understood, and that stretch of route is one of them. My advice is to let it go, stop thinking about it, and be grateful you made it through intact. The more you dig into this, the more it gets into your head. Trust me on this. Her response was frustrating, but also frightening. She'd clearly experienced or discovered something during her investigation that had made her stop pursuing the story. Something bad enough that even years later she refused to discuss it. But I couldn't let it go. The missing hours in my logbook, the memories of that strange journey, the responsibility I felt for not warning that other driver, they all haunted me. I needed to understand what had happened, even if the understanding didn't bring any comfort. And some of them wouldn't make it through. Wouldn't be lucky enough to find their way back to Route 16. Would instead disappear into that strange space where roads fold in on themselves and reality becomes negotiable. I think about it often. About those 6 hours of missing data in my logbook. About the white surface that wasn't ice. About the phantom truck frozen in impossible positions. I think about the GPS showing simplified terrain because it couldn't render the truth. I think about being directed there deliberately by database modifications no one could explain. Mostly, I think about how close I came to becoming another missing driver statistic, another unexplained disappearance in the Alaska wilderness. The only difference between me and those who vanished was luck, or timing, or some factor I couldn't identify that let me pass through that strange space instead of being trapped in it. I still drive trucks in Alaska, still take runs to remote locations, still navigate through winter conditions that would terrify most people. But I'm more careful now about which routes I trust, more skeptical of technology that claims to know better than experience. And whenever I see a GPS suggesting an alternate route, a shortcut that promises time savings, I remember that white surface and the phantom truck and the 6 hours that don't exist in my logbook. I remember that some routes take you places you were never meant to go, and sometimes the shortest distance between 2 points passes through somewhere that isn't quite part of our normal world. The old Galena Hall Road is still there, waiting between those mile markers, ready to appear on the GPS units of unsuspecting drivers. And I know that eventually, someone else will follow those directions, will make the turn into the trees, will drive through that strange space, and either emerge on Route 16 like I did, or disappear like the others. I hope they make it through. Hope they're lucky. Hope they figure out soon enough that they're somewhere they shouldn't be, and find their way back to real roads and normal geography. But I know some of them won't. Because that route doesn't follow the same rules as normal roads, and it doesn't treat all travelers the same way. For reasons I don't understand and probably never will, it lets some drivers pass while keeping others forever. I made it through, but every time I drive past that turnoff, I feel the weight of those who didn't. Feel the responsibility of knowing about that strange space and being unable to warn people in any way they'd believe. So, I'm telling this story. Maybe someone will read it and remember it when their GPS suggests an alternate route in Alaska. Maybe someone will think twice before trusting technology over instinct. Maybe one person will make a different choice and avoid the experience I had. Or maybe not. Maybe the road will keep claiming its share of travelers, keep pulling people into that space between real places, keep adding to the list of unexplained disappearances. All I know for certain is this. If you're driving in Alaska and your GPS shows you a route called the Galena Hall Road, don't take it. Don't trust the time savings it promises. Don't believe it when it says the route is viable. Just stay on the main highways. Take the longer path. Accept the extra time. Because some shortcuts don't just take you to your destination faster. They take you through places that shouldn't exist, past vehicles that can't be real, across surfaces that only pretend to be natural. And once you've been there, once you've seen how thin the boundary is between normal roads and impossible spaces, you can never drive with quite the same confidence again. The old Galena Hall Road is still there, still waiting, still ready to appear on GPS screens and lure in the next traveler who trusts technology more than instinct. I got out. But my logbook still shows those 6 hours of missing time, and sometimes late at night I wonder, did I really get out? Or am I still driving through that white space, and everything since then is just what my mind has constructed to make sense of being trapped somewhere that doesn't quite follow the rules of normal reality? I tell myself I'm back in the real world. Tell myself I made it through. But I can't shake the feeling that something about me changed during those 6 hours, that I brought something back with me from that strange space, or left something behind. And every time I see fresh tire tracks turning off onto that closed road, I wonder if the driver who made them will be as lucky as I was, or if they'll become another story, another warning that nobody quite believes, another name added to the list of people who drove off the map and never came back.